Good morning and welcome to the show. You are listening to Swarbrick on Sunday, brand new to LBC. Hope we find you very well this Sunday morning. Coming up.
When we're one-on-one in the Oval Office, we have a good, warm relationship. I mean, he calls me alarmist and I hit back and say I'm a realist.
Exclusively on LBC, President Trump's COVID advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci, on what the UK has got right and wrong and his complicated relationship with the president. Plus,
I don't say I would have done a better job than anyone else, but I just say on this issue of international coordination, I would have been trying, at least, to get that going.
He's not saying he would have done a better job than anyone else, but former Prime Minister Tony Blair in the papers today criticising the government on Brexit, and on LBC later criticising the government for their response to the pandemic. You'll hear from him in the programme.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Swarbrick on Sunday on LBC.
Very good morning to you. Welcome to Swarbrick on Sunday. I am Tom Swarbrick. We are with you every Sunday, 10 a.m. until 1. We are live here in Westminster, and we are not just being pumped into your ear holes. You can also watch us live. Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. We're everywhere. It's a full-out assault on all your senses. Coming up, we'll speak to Robert Buckland, Secretary of State for Justice, in the next hour. Appropriately, of course, given the legal changes that are coming, not just on Brexit, but also on the coronavirus as well, with the rule of 6 set to come into force in England tomorrow, meaning that you will be breaking the law if you gather in a group of 7, indoors or outdoors, for a reason that isn't listed by the government as exempt. This is a change that we're told is required because of the increase in cases to something around 3,000 a day across England. Earlier this week, Professor Chris Whitty described the new law as the minimum change we have to make. Take a listen.
We all have to be really aware that the things that have to be done to keep this virus under control until we have the technologies, the drugs, the vaccines, the tests that the Prime Minister and Patrick were talking about, are damaging. They are socially damaging in the ways that people talked about, for example, meeting up with grandparents. They're clearly economically damaging, and they're damaging to other areas of health, other bits of the NHS, which is something I obviously care about very deeply. But we have to do them because the alternative is worse. The alternative is an overwhelmed system and all the things that go with it that I think people were clear about early on. And what we as a society, all of us, are trying to do is do the minimum that has to be done so that we minimise the damage, but enough that things don't go out of control. And what was clear in the last little while is things had started to go out of control, and therefore we need to do more. But I don't see any evidence that the British people cannot endure. What the British people want to understand is why this is happening, and that we are trying to make sure that we're doing the minimum necessary and not going further than we have to. But at this point, the graphs are going up. You can't argue with those numbers.
Professor Chris Whitty earlier this week talking about regaining control, talking about the things that we all have to endure, the minimum that we have to do to get control of this. Is this therefore a change we need to make? Joining me now is Lord Jonathan Sumption, former Supreme Court judge, who writes in the Sunday Times this morning that the ban on socialising in groups of more than 6 is unenforceable except in a Stasi-style surveillance state with a poisonous network of informers. Very good to have you on the programme, Lord Sumption. Thank you for coming in. Why unenforceable?
You can enforce it if you're sufficiently intrusive. You can put spies on every street. You can have marshals watching through windows. You can do all the disagreeable things which I pointed out in my article. But unless you do that, people are not going to respect it unless they think it's a good idea. Many people do, but there's a very large number who don't.
Why is it not a good idea to try and regain control of a virus that is spreading out of control?
It's an excellent idea to get control of the virus if it was possible. But the fact is, it's not possible. We have tried the most aggressive form of social distancing possible, a complete lockdown. Other European countries have done it even more fiercely than we have. Does it work? No, it does not. That's why we're in the current position. The problem about a lockdown was pointed out to the government by SAGE on 2 occasions before it was imposed, once on the 25th of February and once on the 16th of March. What they said on both of those occasions was that a lockdown does not reduce deaths. It only spreads them over a longer period. So you have 3 choices. You can have no lockdown, you can have a permanent lockdown until somebody devises a safe and effective vaccine. We have no idea when that will be. And the third choice is you can have a strictly temporary lockdown for long enough to enable the NHS intensive care capacity to catch up. Initially, the government adopted that third approach. But then, when it had successfully boosted the capacity of the NHS and succeeded in that policy, it lost its way. This happened at the beginning of May, when they continued the lockdown after its only sensible objective had been achieved. The problem with the government's present policy is that it is not possible for governments to get control of a virus that has become endemic without taking steps which are so brutal and intrusive as to destroy our society, our economy, our children's education, and everything that makes it worthwhile to be alive.
Is your argument then that the lockdown was ineffective in stopping the spread of the virus, but was effective in allowing the government to build up capacity to deal with the consequences of the virus that was running amok, particularly in those more elderly and more vulnerable?
I think that it was effective in allowing the NHS's ICU capacity to catch up. The peak of hospitalisations was achieved on the 11th of April. By the end of April, the government had brought on stream large amounts of additional capacity through the Nightingale hospitals and the requisitioning of private health capacity. And the fact is we have never come anywhere close.
So are you, sorry to interrupt, but are you then saying, well, if it's not lockdown as we've previously experienced it, and if it's not this sort of Stasi state that you're referring to in this piece, what is it that is relied upon to try and manage, control, in whatever way, whether it's ICU capacity or just the spread of it? What else is it that can be relied upon to help control this?
I don't believe that there is any effective way of eliminating an endemic virus.
No, I agree. You can't. Once it's here, it's here, and that was the SAGE notes make that clear. But
short of a vaccine,
but there is no country that has just returned completely to where we were before this. Even Sweden, where there famously is no lockdown, has brought in social distancing measures.
It has brought in much more moderate social distancing measures than we have. I mean, what the most striking lesson of all this is that there are many things that affect the progress of the virus. I suspect that the most important is the underlying state of health of the population, which varies from one European country to another. One thing that doesn't seem to make a difference is government action. So you have the minimum of government action in Sweden, the maximum of government action in Spain, and what is the result? Spain is currently much worse off than Sweden.
But in a way, Lord Samshire, you're talking more as an epidemiologist than as a lawyer here. You're speaking about matters that pertain to...
I'm not talking as a lawyer. I am not talking as a lawyer, but I'm not talking as an epidemiologist either. I'm talking as a reasonably well-informed citizen. Remember that the ministers who make these decisions, they're not epidemiologists either. What they do is that they look at the epidemiological evidence that is submitted to them. Most of that evidence is in the public domain. We can all look at it for ourselves, and informed citizens not only have the right, but also, I would suggest, the moral duty to have a view of their own on these matters.
So you would welcome the personal choice, people's own common sense, that dictates to them what actions they perform. You've spoken previously about if there were a pub open that you could walk into, however busy it would be, you would like to make that decision for yourself.
And I've done so since the pubs were opened. Yes, I mean, the fact is that leaving it to individual decision is a lot more efficient. We all have completely different degrees of vulnerability.
Yes.
We are surrounded by people who have different degrees of vulnerability. We can make decisions which are appropriate for ourselves and for those around us, whereas the government's lawmaking is a blunderbuss. It's a one-size-fits-all approach, which involves forbidding large numbers of things that are completely harmless, as well as many things that are potentially harmful.
Do you think it's Well, you clearly do. It's too much of an erosion of freedom that this country has hard fought for in the past.
That is a distinct point, and I do believe that, yes. It seems to me that there are some... let's assume for a moment that this policy was effective, contrary to all the evidence. After all, why are we in a position where infections are increasing if the policies adopted in the last 6 months worked? Mm-hmm. But even if there was some evidence that these stratagems worked, to my mind, there is a price which it is not worth paying to reduce the level of deaths. Safety first is fine up to a point, but you do have to ask yourself, what are you putting second, third and fourth? And if what you're putting second, third and fourth is the whole of our national life and our economy and our civilization as social human beings, that is not a price worth paying.
I would love to have you back on the programme to talk at length about this, because I could go on, but I want to come on to another law change that is happening in the short order, which is to Brexit and the changes that are coming through the bill that is being presented. Do you think that this change that undermines international law brings shame on this country, as Sir John Major and Tony Blair think?
Well, of course it does. To renege on an international agreement, which you made just 9 months ago, is a very extraordinary thing to do. Personally, I think that Boris Johnson's Northern Ireland Protocol agreement, agreed in October and formally made in January, was not a very sensible agreement to make. He's absolutely right to say that it severs two parts of the United Kingdom by introducing an Irish customs barrier across the Irish Sea. But that's what he agreed to last year. It was a serious mistake, but that's no reason for doubling down on that mistake by having made that agreement, then trying to repudiate it.
There is the ministerial code, which all ministers are bound to... are bound to, and in doing so follow the rule of law. Is your assessment that this breach of international law, as Brandon Lewis, the government minister, put it last week, is your assessment that breaks the ministerial code, and if so, what consequences could follow?
It does break the ministerial code, because the ministerial code sets out a number of conventions. They are internal United Kingdom conventions, but one of those conventions is that the United Kingdom respects and observes international law. We have for many years observed international law ourselves. We have used it to our own advantage in criticising the acts of others, and it seems to me that it has over the years brought us a great deal more benefit than harm. At any rate, it's a tradition that dates back 150 years or more, and we should adhere to it.
And any argument from the government that says we need to do this because we need to protect ourselves from the most extreme interpretation of the Withdrawal Act that the EU might perform, your response to that is presumably you shouldn't have signed it.
Exactly. I mean, they shouldn't have signed it, but they did.
And just very finally, I note on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph, we were talking about the fact that the law is everywhere right now. Front page of the Sunday Telegraph, Johnson set to opt out of human rights laws. Plans under discussion include opt-outs of the Human Rights Act, which could prevent many migrants and asylum seekers from using the legislation to avoid deportation and protect British soldiers against claims relating to overseas operations. Would you welcome that?
I would need to look at the fine print of the detail, but I do think that the Human Rights Convention has been a very unfortunate influence on English law.
In what way?
It has basically undermined democratic accountability by making many issues which are essentially political in nature and on which people disagree into judicial issues, and that has the effect of withdrawing it from the arena of public and parliamentary debate. In a democracy, that seems to me to be a very unsatisfactory thing to do.
Very grateful to you for your time this morning. Lord Jonathan Sumption, former Supreme Court Justice, many thanks for being here on Swarbrick on Sunday this morning. Keen to get your thoughts on what Jonathan has told us there, particularly about this law change regarding coronavirus. Do you think it is needed? Do you think it is enforceable? Is it akin to a Stasi state? Is that how you feel about it? The idea of these COVID marshals wandering around, poking through your window to check you haven't got more than 7 people in there. Is that something that is not particularly British? 0345 6060 973 is the number. We'll get the view of an epidemiologist in a few moments' time too. Tom Swarbrick here, Swarbrick on Sunday. The time now, 10:18.
LBC
10:21 is the time. Swarbrick on Sunday here. Tom Swarbrick with you until 1 o'clock this afternoon. Good to have your company. You can, of course, as well as listening to us on LBC, if you wish to, watch us live on Twitter, on Facebook and YouTube. You can see us in stunning Technicolor here down in Westminster. Before we speak to Professor Gabriel Scali, President of Epidemiology and Public Health at the Royal Society of Medicine, I'm very keen to get his view on what we've just heard from Lord Jonathan Sumption about the lack of enforceability, as he sees it, of these law changes coming in on Monday. I want to run you through the front pages of the Sunday papers because they also contain elements of legal changes that are due to come. Let's start this morning with the Sunday Telegraph. As I mentioned to Lord Sumption, Johnson's set to opt out of human rights laws, PM to open second confrontation with EU in bid to ease migrant deportation cases. This is a sort of hardy perennial which comes around relatively regularly, that a Conservative Prime Minister wishes to derogate from the Human Rights Act. We wait to see if the Johnson government does. The Sunday Express, Boris pledges to see justice is truly done. The most radical crime shake-up in 20 years will give teenage terrorists whole life terms, the Sunday Express says. Your Sunday Mirror, McGregor in cop quiz over sex assault. Those are claims that he furiously denies, allegations in that paper. The Sun on Sunday. Mason's party gas vid shame. This is England's Mason Greenwood, who's had difficulties regarding some of the lockdown laws. The Sun are saying he is an airhead for being caught in a party where he was inhaling nitrous oxide from those canisters. Mail on Sunday, ends the trauma of lone births. Thousands of women are enduring the unimaginable anguish of having to give birth alone during draconian COVID-19 rules. Your Observer this morning, top lawyers slam minister for wrecking UK's reputation. The Attorney General, Suella Braverman, yesterday accused of sacrificing the UK's reputation, sidelining legal advisers, bypassing the ministerial code during an extraordinary confrontation with some of the country's top lawyers. Robert Buckland, Justice Secretary, will join us just after the news at 11. And on the Sunday Times, very concerning, this virus cases in care homes spiral again. Matt Hancock admits new risk to residents. This is from a Department of Health report that the paper has got hold of. It was circulated on Friday, stating that the rate of coronavirus recorded through satellite tests, almost all of which take place in care homes, has now quadrupled since the start of the month. It stands at an estimated 1,100 new cases every day. On that issue, let us turn to Professor Gabriel Scali, President of Epidemiology and Public Health at the Royal Society of Medicine and a member of the Independent SAGE Group. Thank you for coming on the programme this morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Your view of the rise in cases and what seems to be the proportion of cases rising in care homes versus in the community.
Yes, we're definitely seeing a rise in cases, no doubt about it. A lot of people were saying earlier, we're testing more, but no, there's a very, very substantial rise in cases. And the age profile at the early part of that rise was very much in the 20s, 30s, 40s. But as expected, as the virus spreads in the community, it spreads everywhere in the community, so it will start to spread to older people. Now, a lot of older people have been doing a fantastic job of looking after themselves. They're the ones who have kept to the social distancing. They're the ones who have been very careful with masks and when they're out and so on. But it's almost inevitable that it can spread into nursing homes and care homes, for example, because some of the staff there are very young, and care homes often they are badly paid, sometimes working in more than one care home. So it is very worrying that it has spread there, but it is what one would expect, really, with this big growth in the number of cases. Clearly, in order to mitigate the risks to care homes, staff, in particular, as you point out, coming into care homes, need to be tested regularly. And we read this morning that the promised weekly testing for staff and monthly test for care home residents was promised in July. It reached the target that was set only last week. The majority of COVID cases carried out by care homes now take more than 72 hours to be processed. And I wonder if what we're seeing, as Lord Sumption was sort of, I think, alluding to a little earlier, is a partial lockdown or stricter enforcement of the rules in order to allow the government to catch up with testing to prevent cases rising like in care homes. Oh, well, I just think the whole test and trace thing has been a shambles, the whole thing. There isn't one bit of it that has worked well. And the care homes bit, I think, is deeply worrying, of course, because we know just how vulnerable they are and how important it is to keep older people safe. But what the government really needs to do, and my worry is that as these numbers take off and the virus spreads more widely, the testing system will just be overwhelmed. And that's deeply, deeply problematical. And I think the government needs to do an urgent review. And it could do with some fresh thinking and preferably public health thinking about this, because leaving it to Deloitte...
Has it not got that already?
No, that's one of the that's the big problem. Speaking as a public health doctor, of course, that public health really wasn't involved in this. SAGE, the official SAGE, didn't have anyone from public health amongst their invited experts, and they really don't take public health advice. The chief medical officer is not a public health doctor. The chief scientist is not a public health doctor, and they have ignored public health. But it's public health people on the ground that are doing a great job in the local teams and working with local authorities, and we need more of that.
Whatever the reasons are for the new lockdown rules that are coming in, this law change coming on Monday, the primary reason, of course, being to try and stop the case numbers increasing. Do you think it is enforceable? I mean, do you see yourself being marshalled well by the COVID marshals that are going to stop you gathering in a gathering of more than 6?
Well, let's start from the basic principle of how you get these things done. You get these things done by consent, by the consent of the whole population. And if it is going to be enforced by anyone, it should be enforced by family and by neighbours and by workmates. It's that consensual approach to the law that's really, really important. Yes, there does need to be some sort of mechanism for those that are determined to transgress the law. But we're getting to the stage where it's deeply worrying in that the public have lost faith to a significant extent in the government. And of course, the other issue that's a big story today is about the government itself deciding to break the law, and yet the government, in terms of the EU, but here we are, the government telling us that they're going to enforce this local law. And then,
do you think that has genuine read across?
I do.
You think that? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just the way you were reading the stories out there. On one hand, it's the government is in causing huge turmoil by saying they're going to break the law. On the other, and then we're moving on Monday to a situation where we're going to be told we're going to have the law enforced.
Yes, I'll put that point. It's a bit like the Dominic Cummings thing. It's another example of do as we say, not as we do. And I think every time one of those things happen, it undermines confidence. I will put those points to the Justice Secretary a little bit later on, Professor. Just finally, does this law change not put pay to the idea that common sense can be relied upon by people? Is this also not a suggestion that people actually haven't been following the guidance, haven't been listening to the rules? They've been gathering in of more than 30, the raves that take place, the protests that take place. People can't be trusted.
Well, it's been a very long time so far, this outbreak. And of course, people's attention to it will fade with time. But I think it's much more than this. It's about confusion. It's about not getting clear, consistent messages. I mean, I prefer if the government would actually just pause now and look with really external eyes as to how they're going to do this, because we don't even have a plan. Next time you get a minister on, ask them, what is the strategy? Where do they want to get to with COVID-19? Because they have had no plan since they produced an action plan on the 3rd of March. And it's was it forgotten about ages ago? So we've no strategic direction and we've no plan. For me, that's the big gap.
That's a heck of a gap. Professor, thank you. Professor Gabriel Scali, President of Epidemiology and Public Health at the Royal Society of Medicine, member of the independent SAGE group. Again, it was when this was announced during the week, I don't know about you, but it was the first time I really felt like someone was impinging on my personal freedom in a way that was ineffective. How on earth are COVID marshals, volunteers paid for by local councils, recruited, well, presumably at some stage by Monday, to go around and try and enforce? They don't have any actual powers. They're just asking you politely if you would break up your gathering. I don't know how effective that's going to be, and I don't know how many people are going to go along with it, to be honest. So when you hear the government saying we expect citizens to abide by the rule of law, and yet on the same week that the government says we are not going to be abiding by international law, do you throw your hands up and say, well, I'm not going to bother either? 0345 6060 973 84850 to text. You can, of course, tweet at LBC. We'll be talking lots more about Brexit. The Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and Labour MP for Sheffield Healy will join us shortly. Plus,
how can we reproach Russia when we are showing such scant regard for our treaty obligations?
The bill is in the House of Lords at the moment. That's one peer who is pretty peeved. Lord Howard, former Conservative leader, will speak to him a little bit later on the programme about whether this bill that undermines the Withdrawal Act is actually going to make it through. You're listening to Swarbrick on Sunday. Tom Swarbrick here, live from Westminster. 10:31 is the time. News headlines now. Bill Overton.
A former Supreme Court justice agrees Boris Johnson's plans to rethink and renege on his own Brexit deal constitutes a breach of the ministerial code. Lord Sumption's just been telling us it's too late for the Prime Minister to try to row back on the protocol signed with the EU earlier this year. Two former Downing Street inhabitants are calling on MPs to reject the internal market bill. Tony Blair and Sir John Major jointly say it'll risk the peace in Northern Ireland and calls into question the UK's integrity. Police have shut down a series of illegal parties overnight ahead of tougher coronavirus restrictions taking effect tomorrow. Officers are warning people against having a party weekend to compensate for the so-called rule of six. Weather-wise, mostly fine and dry with some warm sunshine across England and Wales today. Scotland and Northern Ireland starting with some heavy rain before things clear up. A high of 26 degrees.
This is LBC.
Sunday here on LBC. Worth flagging to you too that as well as addressing down for the government from Tony Blair on Brexit, the former Prime Minister has also told LBC in an exclusive interview that you will hear later today and we'll play you a bit of in the programme, that the way to defeat coronavirus is through testing as many people as possible, whether or not they have symptoms. Now, earlier on in the week, you had Matt Hancock saying that it was unacceptable that people without symptoms were trying to get tests. And I wonder to what extent you think that the new measures coming into force on Monday are designed to try and help buy the government time to build up that testing capacity that is so needed in order to get as many people, regardless of whether they have symptoms or not, tested so we can try and unlock further. Ben is in Newquay on 84850 this morning. Tom, I've got no issue per se with partial lockdown to not overwhelm the NHS, as long as all the empty beds and ceased procedures are addressed for all the non-COVID stuff, he says. Absolutely, which reflects what Lord Sumption was telling us about the effects of this lockdown. Here's Keith. Tom, this is the conversation we had back in March. Jonathan Sumption is 100% correct. Lockdown only needs to protect the NHS. Without a vaccine, everything over that will cause more deaths from the economic crash than the virus will. The Oxford vaccine is more than a year away at least. You can't roll out a vaccine without long-term clinical trials, he says. Which again makes me wonder whether people are going to follow this rule when it is introduced on Monday. 0345 6060 973 is the number. Come to your calls on that in just a moment. Let's turn to Brexit, though. Louise Haigh is Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Labour MP for Sheffield Healy. Thank you for coming on Swarbrick on Sunday this morning, Louise. Good to have you on.
Good morning, Tom.
We'll come to COVID in just a moment, but let's start with Brexit. The Observer front page says top lawyers slam minister for wrecking the UK's reputation. Does Labour understand why this change needs to happen?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and it's something we've been racking our brains over for the last week, really, in terms of the government's motivations. Either in suggesting that the protocol, which was negotiated personally by Boris Johnson, now threatens the internal market of the UK. Boris Johnson didn't understand or read what he was signing a year ago, in which case it massively questions his competence to govern, or he understood what he was signing and he glossed over it and is only now returning it to it now in the full expectation that he was going to break it, or that the consequences that he is laying out are not as significant as they seem, and it's a needless provocation to the EU in order to serve wider political means within the Tory party. We are clear that breaching international law is not necessary to preserve the UK's internal market, and instead of this unnecessary posturing, the government should be back at the negotiating table, securing a deal with the European Union.
It's only not necessary if it's the case that the EU isn't looking to break the UK's internal market. And according to the Prime Minister, when he wrote a piece in the paper yesterday, his suggestion is that the EU is looking to block food coming into Northern Ireland from Great Britain. That's unacceptable.
Well, and I think we've heard from representatives from the Irish government this morning that there's absolutely no intention or objective to do anything of the sort. The Prime Minister...
So, but they are believed over the Prime Minister's word. If we're taking whoever's word for it, we're believing the Irish side or the EU side word over the Prime Minister's reasons for this change.
Well, look, there's been several justifications this week, and yesterday was only the latest in the reasons why this was necessary. We'd not heard until yesterday that was a possibility that the EU were threatening this. Earlier in the week, it was that the protocol itself threatens the Good Friday Agreement and threatens the UK internal market. This is a deal, let's not forget, that the Prime Minister himself negotiated and signed, and was designed to preserve the Good Friday Agreement and the peace that has been secured in the 22 years since. To suggest now that it potentially or fatally undermines it, as I say, suggests that either he didn't understand what he was signing up to, or it's an unnecessary provocation and escalation that could potentially...
Yes, I'll come back to the point, though, that it does take two to tango on this. And if it is the case that the word inside the Withdrawal Act could allow for an extreme interpretation that might see the EU placing these kinds of barriers on, do you not accept that it is in Britain's interests to be able to remedy that? And therefore, regardless of what this is, a breach of international law, actually the most important thing is to protect Britain. And as it stands at the moment, Labour is looking like it won't be backing this bill and therefore won't be looking to give Britain the protection it needs, the government would say.
Well, look, the EU has its negotiating position, we have ours. The right and the correct way to resolve these issues is through the joint committee between the UK and the European Union. And as far as we are aware, and I'm yet to hear confirmation from the government on this, state aid rules and issues around the issues that have been raised around the UK IM bill have not actually been raised by government at the joint committee. So we're not even having these debates and negotiations. And rather than reaching agreement and getting closer to to each other's position and finding a compromise, the government's actions through breaking international treaty obligations set these negotiations back. So of course we want to see as unfettered access as possible internally within the UK. We want to protect...
As possible.
Yeah, of course, because again, let me say, Tom, that
if that unfettered access is watered down by whatever interpretation, presumably Labour would want to be in the position to tell the people of this country, "Don't worry, we'll find a way of remedying that."
Look, let me just repeat that the protocol was negotiated in the first place in order to preserve the Good Friday Agreement and avoid a border on the island of Ireland. In avoiding that border on the island, there was always going to be necessarily some checks and controls in between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The government knew that when they negotiated the protocol last year. Government ministers have repeatedly confirmed that certain checks and controls will be necessary. What's important is that they are minimised and that communities live as seamlessly as possible, east-west as well as north-south. That's what needs to be agreed now with the European Union, and that's what we're holding the government to account on.
So as it stands at 10:41 this Sunday morning, Labour will not be voting for this bill if it reaches the Commons again.
Tomorrow, if it still contains proposals that breach our international treaty obligations, no, we will not be voting for it.
And this would not have been the case. This border in the Irish Sea would not have happened had Theresa May's withdrawal agreement gone through. That would have put a backstop on the Irish border and contained all sorts of difficulties that we spent many, many months going over. Some of your former colleagues, I note, one of your former MPs, Gloria De Piero, has suggested that it was a mistake for Labour MPs not to back Theresa May's deal. Do you think that is a correct assessment?
Well, there were lots of reasons why we didn't back Theresa May's deal, and those reasons were very similar to the reasons we didn't back Boris Johnson's deal earlier this year. We didn't oppose her deal nor Boris Johnson's deal on the basis of the backstop or the protocol. We tried to work with the government in order to make sure that the border issues were resolved and that businesses could trade freely and the peace in Northern Ireland could be preserved.
Sure.
But, the issues that we voted against it remain the same, that we were very concerned about the watering down of rights and standards. And so
the only Brexit deal that Labour would vote for is a Brexit deal negotiated by Labour.
Well, we're yet to see a Brexit deal come back. You mean a free trade agreement?
Frankly, anything, because it strikes me at the moment that there is nothing that a Conservative or any other government other than a Labour government could produce that the Labour Party would be happy with. And the charge against Keir Starmer has always been that he was a Remainer, he didn't want Brexit to happen, and this is another example, perhaps, one might argue, of Labour trying to block Brexit.
there's no blocking Brexit, Tom. We've left the European Union. This bill is about securing the internal market and allowing the Westminster government to take back powers from Brussels and negotiate trade agreements in the future. We will absolutely support that if it removes clauses that breach our international treaty obligations. You know, the transition period will end on the 31st of December, and on the 1st of January, we'll be attempting to negotiate trade deals around the world. The idea that this approach by the government has not hurt our reputation on the international stage is quite frankly absurd, and we only have to look to the Speaker of the House of Representatives in the US, who has said very clearly, if the government continues with this approach, it will fatally undermine our chances of getting a free trade deal with the USA.
Thank you so much for your time. That's Louise Haigh, Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Labour MP for Sheffield Heeley. A reminder that the Justice Secretary, Robert Buckland, will be joining us a little after the news at 11 o'clock. Let's speak to Lynn in Preston this morning on the subject of the Rule of Six coming in on Monday. Morning to you, Lynn.
Morning, Tom. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Is this something that you're going to be abiding by?
Well, I'm in the age group that it doesn't really... do you know what I mean? I'm 66 now. I don't meet up with, because I have friends scattered to the four winds and family that are scattered to the four winds. But Rule of Six, very arbitrary. You know, I don't think it's going to do anything to control the R number. People are already getting worried about Christmas. What do they do if they have 7, 8? You know, and it's beginning to turn into a bit of a Stasi state, this. It worries me about COVID marshals on the streets.
Yes.
I think that's the quickest way of starting social unrest that I can think
and
of.
if people don't, as you say, Lynn, if people don't understand the reasons why, or maybe they don't have it to explain to them, or even if they do have it explained to them, they think, hang on a minute, that doesn't feel great, then you're right, I think, that compliance is going to be pretty low with this, which is a problem. Yeah, if it is the case that this will stop the spread, that is a problem.
Yeah, it's the compliance thing. I mean, it doesn't make sense. It's not logical. I think compliance is, I mean, even for myself, the rules change every week, and you just think, well, where am I? A lot of people, even friends in my age group, say, oh, I've given up with it now. I'm not.
So would you rather be in the position that Jonathan Sumption was outlining at the start of the programme this morning, that we just leave it up to people's common sense? You know about social distancing. If you want to wash your hands, you wash your hands. You want to wear a mask, you wear a mask. But let's let people make decisions for themselves.
There's issues around masks. I'm talking to a friend, how many problems we're going to see about a year down the line from mass mask wearing, possibly breathing problems or chest problems from that alone.
All right. Well, Lynn, mind how you go. Thank you for the call. 0345 6060 973 is the number. Sam's in Red Hill this morning. We can't make our own decisions when surrounded by people refusing to wear masks, Sam says. Come to your calls on that in a few moments. Plus,
we hope that we will get a free trade agreement between the UK and the EU, but we've got to make sure that we have an insurance policy if the EU aren't as cooperative as we hope they will.
How likely is that free trade agreement, given what the government is proposing to do to Brexit legislation? I'll be joined by the Justice Secretary, Lord Chancellor Robert Buckland, after the news at 11. You're listening to Swarbrick on Sunday, LBC 1047.
Britain's Conversation, LBC. Swarbrick on Sunday, live from Westminster.
Here's Lynn on 84850 this morning. Morning to you, Lynn. Tom, Lord Sumption is spot on. Ridiculous measures to control the R number. Yes, it is fast becoming a Stasi state. Meanwhile, Mitch is here. Tom, since you appear to be one of those people in the media who knows everything, that is definitely not true. What would you do to curb the rise in the R rate if the Rule of Six is not the way to go? We already test considerably more than any other country in the EU except Denmark, so clearly that's not the answer. So what is? Enlighten us, says Mitch. Well, Mitch, I have to say I'm just delighted I don't get to make the decisions, because I'm not going to. It is obviously incredibly difficult. No one's done this before. It's very, very new. And to an extent, the government is always going to have to be bumped along by changes in the evidence as they get them. Clearly, more testing is something that they're looking for. Otherwise, they wouldn't be bothering with this moonshoot idea, which is frankly to test everybody all the time, always. So testing is massively important. And when it comes to care homes, as we've seen front page of the Sunday Times, some of these tests are taking more than 72 hours to be processed. 52% of them are taking more than 72 hours to be processed. That is not very helpful. So there's something going on that is not going right in that process of having the test, getting it to the lab, getting it back to the person so they can get a result to move on. We'll put some of that to the Justice Secretary a bit later. 0345 6060 973 is the number. Let's come on to Northern Ireland and the fact that this law change is coming in on Brexit to change elements of the Withdrawal Act, and just how we got to the point where the government is trying to dress up as a protection the fact that it was something that it negotiated itself in its own deal and perhaps should have checked before we got to this point. Ben Kentridge is LBC's Westminster correspondent, joins me live on the programme. Welcome, Ben. Thank you for coming in this Sunday morning. Tell us how we got to the point where Boris Johnson is saying to his MPs, trust me, we need to break the law.
Tom, it seems a lifetime ago, but it's actually just 11 months since Boris Johnson, on a historic Saturday sitting of Parliament, stood in the House of Commons and heralded the new deal he had agreed with the EU. It was a deal that many people thought he would never get because the key sticking point until then had been the issue of Northern Ireland. And why is that? Well, it's because the EU, from the start of this, has been very, very concerned about making sure that goods travelling from Britain into the EU single market via the Republic of Ireland had all the checks and met all the standards that the EU needs them to. The two ways you can do that: you either have checks on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, but you can't do that because of the Good Friday Agreement, which of course brings peace to Northern Ireland. The other way you do it is you have the checks somewhere else, and the somewhere else is between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, i.e. in the Irish Sea. Now, that wasn't something that Theresa May was willing to accept, but Boris Johnson did. And despite a real controversy, a real row about that, not least of all from the Conservatives' then partners in the DUP, on that historic Saturday, this was Boris Johnson heralding what he called a great deal.
Now is the time. Now is the time, Mr. Speaker, to get this thing done. Let's speak now, both for the 52 and for the 48. Let's go for a deal that can heal this country. Let's go for a deal that can heal this country and can allow us all to express our legitimate desires for the deepest possible friendship and partnership with our neighbours. A deal that allows us to create a shared destiny with them, and a deal that also allows us to express our confidence in our own democratic institutions, to make our own laws, to determine our own future, to believe in ourselves once again as an open, generous, global, outward-looking, free-trading, united kingdom. That is the prospect. That is the prospect that this deal offers our country. It is a great prospect and a great deal, and I commend it to the House.
Now, Tom, there's a curious thing here because at the time, cabinet ministers, including the then Brexit secretary, admitted that this would involve some sort of border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But one person said it wouldn't. That one person, Boris Johnson. And frankly, nobody believed him. But here he is again this week, once again, talking, and note the difference in tone from the clip we just heard, about the risks of the deal that he himself signed into law just 8 months ago.
I see the risk that certain, I think, extreme interpretations of the treaty might place to the peace process in Northern Ireland, to the Good Friday Agreement. Nobody wants to see a barrier down the Irish Sea. So what we're doing, which I think would be very, very injurious, so what we're doing is putting a safety net beneath which things cannot go wrong to protect peace and protect the settlement in our United Kingdom.
Did you hear that, Tom? Very, very injurious. This is something that was contained in the deal that was signed back in January, but is clearly of concern and has been all along. Now, there were always questions about how Boris Johnson was going to meet that promise not to have checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And we found out last weekend, effectively a new bill being introduced in the Commons, it was introduced last week, that will give ministers the power to decide which goods need those checks and which don't, totally separate from anything the EU says. Immediately, we had lawyers saying, hold on, this breaks international law. And quite astonishingly, that was confirmed by Brandon Lewis, the Northern Ireland Secretary, in the Commons this week.
Yes, this does break international law in a very specific and limited way. We are taking the power to disapply the EU law concept of direct effect required by Article 4 in a certain very tightly defined circumstances. And there are clear precedents for the UK and indeed other countries needing to consider their international obligations as circumstances change.
Now, that threat, effectively, to undermine the treaty that's already been agreed was met with fury, absolute fury in Brussels. Threats to withdraw from the talks about the trade deal, threats of legal action. None of that, Tom, will necessarily concern Number 10 too much. But what will is the concern about on the backbenches. There's been calls for one of your next guests, Robert Buckland, the Justice Secretary, to resign. There's been outrage from Remainers and Brexiteers alike, including, and this is where it could get interesting, in the House of Lords, where prominent Brexiteers like Michael Howard, like Norman Lamont, have voiced their opposition. And that means, as this goes through Parliament, this row that started this week could get a lot more heated, Tom, and things could get a lot more difficult for the government in the weeks to come. And
I note there's been some commentary that the rebels on this, both in the Commons and the Lords, but certainly in the Commons, they fear the pushback if they do rebel, in the same way that the whip was withdrawn by Boris Johnson of those Tory MPs that rebelled on Brexit previously. And so they need a sort of a figurehead rebel to lead the charge in the House of Commons. Is there any suggestion about who that might be?
Well, at the moment, it's the more the Remain side of the argument. They've tabled them in. People like Damien Green was Theresa May's Deputy Prime Minister, of course, Bob Neill. But there's some suggestion that could get quite a lot of support. But there is, you're absolutely right, real concern about what happened last time there was a big rebellion, and people who have been Conservative MPs for decades in some cases lost the whip overnight. But I think it's in the Lords where it gets interesting, because, as I say, if people like Lord Lamont and Lord Howard, influential, senior, prominent Brexit supporting Conservatives, start to kick up a fuss about this and ultimately lead a rebellion in the Lords, Tom, that blocks the legislation, things could get very, very interesting. You remember the Brexit row in the Supreme Court last year. There are some people, some legal experts, who think that another one may just be on the cards because of this.
It's good to get back to Brexit Commons rows, isn't it? Feels like normality is being restored. Ben, thank you. LBC Westminster correspondent Ben Kentish joining us live this Sunday morning, where we are fast approaching the news at 11 o'clock, after which
we had a difficulty in the United States because the president, up until recently, has not really been wearing a mask, and even now he doesn't wear it.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, President Trump's coronavirus advisor, on the measures that have been put in the States and his complicated relationship with the Commander-in-Chief. Also,
yes, this does break international law in a very specific and limited way.
The rows over Brexit continue. We'll be joined live by the Justice Secretary and Conservative MP for South Swindon, Robert Buckland, who will answer your questions, my questions, our questions, about what on earth the government is doing, how it can be justified, and what happens if it doesn't get the bill through. You're listening to Swarbrick on Sunday, live here on LBC. The news at 11 is next.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation. Swarbrick on Sunday, live from Westminster.
Very good morning to you. Just gone 11 o'clock. You are listening to, and possibly even watching as well, Swarbrick on Sunday this Sunday morning. Hope we find you very well indeed. Loads to come in the programme over the course of the next 2 hours or so. We'll hear from Dr. Anthony Fauci, President Trump's coronavirus advisor, on his relationship with the president, on the managing of the coronavirus epidemic in the States and also here as well. It's a really fascinating interview, particularly about what he makes of the president and mask wearing. You'll hear that a bit later. We'll also speak live to Lord Michael Howard, former Conservative leader, about this bill that is up in the House of Lords at the moment. He, as a Brexiteer, has some severe reservations about it, as do many, given the fact that this does indeed break with international law. The Sunday Times has a piece written by both Tony Blair and Sir John Major, former Prime Ministers, saying that Boris Johnson is bringing shame on the country by undermining the rule of law and jeopardising the Northern Ireland peace process. Let's get straight to it. Robert Buckland is Lord Chancellor, Justice Secretary, Conservative MP for South Swindon, and joins me live in the studio this morning. Thank you for being with us.
Morning, Tom.
Secretary of State. This breaks international law, doesn't it?
It has the potential of creating a conflict with Article 4 of the protocol. It creates a conflict, but we do not want to get there. What we need to do is have an insurance policy if the joint committee, that is the committee that's been set up to agree the operation of the protocol, if the talks break down without agreement. This is a break glass in emergency provision. We don't want to do it. We don't want to have to implement them. And if we are in that position, we will work very, very rapidly and earnestly to get out of it.
But your colleague was right earlier in the week, Brandon Lewis, to say this is a break with international law.
My colleague was absolutely direct about the potential impact of this. And I don't think there's no issue here, Tom. I've said there is a conflict between international law and domestic law if this particular provision is enacted. And what we are seeking to do is, of course, get the agreement. Mm-hmm. We don't want to be in this position. The work on the committee carries on. I believe, actually, we will resolve our differences. We won't have to use this provision, but it would be irresponsible if we didn't, as an insurance policy, put something in place in that eventuality.
I'm going to accept that you're not saying that Brandon Lewis was wrong earlier in the week to say this breaks international law. And I just wonder then, in those circumstances, how comfortable you are with that. As Justice Secretary, you have a duty to protect the rule of law, and you're breaking it.
Well, I don't pretend that this is an easy situation for anybody in the government. We all have a duty as ministers to uphold the rule of law, whoever we are. And I think it's important to remember the context of this. This isn't some sort of, casual decision to ignore or duck a responsibility and pretend that all is going to be well. This is in the context of an unprecedented situation. None of my predecessors, no previous government has ever had to face the challenge that we face.
No previous government has suggested that it's going to break international law.
Well, wrong. Because,
really?
Of course, yes, because we've had a number of occasions, for example, I can think of the prisoner voting example, where we were in clear breach of decisions by the European Court, and that maintained for 12 years. But here's the thing, Tom.
There are circumstances where that was all agreed by the other parties too. George Osborne's changes in 2013 are cited, but other parties agreed to those changes.
No, they weren't agreed. The prisoner voting matter was a real headache. Abu Qatada was another one where there was a real issue about compliance, and indeed compliance on an issue relating to life imprisonment.
So
We've had a number. No, of course, it's never fine. I'm just trying to explain that it's the intention of the government in this instance, as it is on every other occasion, to resolve any difference and to come back into compliance as soon as possible. So I can think of Labour governments that signed declarations on bills that they wanted to pass that said that they were incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. That's the Labour government doing that, and therefore there are precedents for this. I accept, Tom, that these are particularly unusual circumstances, but this is an unprecedented situation, and we're seeking to.
And you're signed off on it. You, as Justice Secretary, you are not happy, but you understand the reasons for it, and therefore you're not going to resign, which some of your colleagues have called on you to do.
The government collectively has taken a decision. I believe that with everything I know about the earnestness of the United Kingdom to get a deal, that these provisions will not have to be invoked. And that's why I think it's important we focus on the deal, and also that colleagues tomorrow remember that Europe will be looking at us. If there is, I'm afraid, more division and weakness in the House of Commons, that will not do the United Kingdom's interests any good.
Let's come on to the underlying reasons, as you would like it, for this change to happen. So yesterday, the Prime Minister wrote in a newspaper that without this law change, the suggestion was that the EU was planning to, quote, stop the transport of food products from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. Is that true?
The Prime Minister is rightly worried about progress or otherwise in the talks. There is a real concern that the United Kingdom at the moment has not been agreed to be a third country for the purposes of these types of transfer. That is something that is awarded to very many countries across the world. At the moment, the Europeans aren't even conceding that. Our worry is that what should be a situation of checks on some goods could become something that it was totally unforeseen.
And the EU have made that clear. They've made this suggestion that they could put a food blockade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
The Prime Minister, when he talks about this, as somebody who is, the lead, if you like, for the United Kingdom, David Frost, of course, leading daily, but who is close to these things, is in a position, I think, to know more about it than anybody else.
Well, and ideally, but the EU has said that's not true.
Well, look, this is a negotiation. I believe that there are legitimate concerns about the progress of the talks. We want them to succeed. We are putting every effort into doing them, but we've also got to be realistic. And let's not mix the two things up, Tom. The FTA, the Free Trade Agreement talks, are one thing. I'm particularly focused when it comes to the Northern Ireland Protocol on the joint committee, which is, of course, the Michael Gove negotiation.
We've almost gone back 11 months to the point where this deal was first signed, and that is part of the problem, isn't it? Downing Street said in the week that part of the reason why we're in this position is because the government had too short a time to agree this, that it was rushed. How much longer did you need?
Well, look, I mean, we go back to a time when it was clear that we had to make an agreement work. It was right. It hasn't worked. No, hold on, because actually the joint committee structure that was set up is designed to resolve those differences, and we believe in it. That is why we are having regular meetings. We believe that those meetings can result in resolution, but this is all about the eventuality or the possibility that they don't. Now, that wasn't something that we believed would happen back in February.
Why?
It is because now, at a stage 3 or 4 months out from Christmas, we are increasingly concerned that we won't get that resolution, and therefore we have to make the contingency. So that was something that you wouldn't have known at the time of the agreement. Even though it's 8 months ago, we all know in the life of politics and things like COVID, 8 months is an eternity, and this is what this year has been.
So it's the EU's fault? It's the failure of negotiation. It's not fault, no, but it's a failure of negotiations to get to the point where that concern that was implicit in the agreement that Boris Johnson signed and said would be very good for the country, that concern is now having to be acted upon because of a breakdown in negotiations or a threat of food blockades. What is it?
Look, there is a concern that we have that both sides have to act in good faith, and if there is a no movement on some basic things like the third country issue, then we are entitled to say, well, hold on here, what is going on? Is everybody actually acting in good faith? Now, I don't want to start having a finger-pointing exercise. I think that is totally counterproductive.
But you ultimately don't believe that the EU is going to, if the worry is that it will put food blockades in.
Well, look, I still believe that, as I did last year, that we will get a deal. That is the absolute settled will of the United Kingdom. Okay. But any suggestion that somehow this is some play to get us into a no further deal is wholly wrong.
You have former prime ministers, Conservative prime ministers, queuing up to slate this. I mean, you've got John Major in the paper saying that this is shocking, it shames Britain. You have Theresa May in the House of Commons suggesting that other countries wouldn't trust Britain if this change goes through. Is she wrong?
I, with respect to all those distinguished former leaders, this is a wholly unprecedented situation. None of them are close to the detail of the negotiation. None of them are having to deal directly with the ins and outs of how to land this deal. And the people who are the government. And that is why we have taken a step that I agree is, in the general run of things, an exceptional step, wholly exceptional step.
People think it's appalling. People think it's a disgrace. They think it's Britain is being traduced by its own government.
I think people need to remember and focus upon the need to get a deal, and it's important that in the light of events that we don't pretend in this particular respect that we can kick the can down the road and then quietly not apply the rules that will of course be binding upon us. If we did that, if we avoided the issue and then were found to be acting illegally, that would be worse, in my opinion, than being upfront about the issue now.
So it's not a question that there will still be trust in Britain, we will still be trusted by our allies, and it's not a sign of incompetence that a deal agreed to in which this problem was inherent, that was previously sold as the best thing since sliced bread, is now we're now being told actually we need to change, we need to break the law in order to guarantee.
No, we're not saying there's a problem with the mechanism in the protocol. We're saying there's a problem in that those parties to the mechanism aren't coming close to an agreement. We believe that with work we can do, what we are adding here is a domestic safeguard. Let's face it, the duty of the government is to uphold the Union of the United Kingdom. That's our policy, that's our belief. We also have something called Parliamentary Sovereignty, which means that Parliament, of course, now is going to be directly involved in this debate and will no doubt have its say about the merits or otherwise of these proposals. That's what's going to start tomorrow, and I'm sure the debate is going to be a lively one.
Brexit has dominated once again. We've run out of time, but one very, very quick question on coronavirus, if you would. Is there any chance that under 11s who are exempt from wearing masks might become exempt from being part of the gathering of 6?
Well, look, I can see the issue, and I know that the Scots have taken a different view. I think our system has the merits of simplicity. It's a very clear rule now. Indoors or outdoors, social events, it's 6 is enough. I think that's the right approach.
So
simplicity. Well, look, we always keep looking at how to calibrate this and vary it, and we have, been very fleet of foot in doing that in recent months. But I think at the moment this has the benefits of extreme simplicity, and that's got to be a good thing for everybody.
Lord Chancellor, grateful for your time. Thank you. Robert Buckland, Lord Chancellor, Justice Secretary, Conservative MP for South Swindon, appearing on Swarbrick on Sunday this morning. After which,
how can we reproach Russia when we are showing such scant regard for our treaty obligations?
Former leader of the Conservative Party, Lord Michael Howard, who has a part to play in this, and that he's got a vote on this bill, will speak to us live in a few moments. Tom Swarbrick here. It's 11:16.
This is LBC.
Morning to you, 11:19 is the time. Tom Swarbrick here, Swarbrick on Sunday, every Sunday from 10 till 1 here on LBC. Hope we find you well. Come to your thoughts in a moment on what you've just heard from Robert Buckland, the Lord Chancellor, about the legal changes that they hope are coming into effect to guarantee, they say, that Britain is protected from some of the more extreme interpretations of the Withdrawal Act, but of course, in doing so, break with international law. Let's turn to Lord Michael Howard, former leader of the Conservative Party, Home Secretary too, from 1993 to 97. Thank you for joining us on the programme this morning, Lord Howard. You've got a decision to make about whether you're going to vote for this. On the current terms, will you be voting for this?
No.
Why not?
Because I don't believe this country should break international law. I never thought I would hear a government minister, far less a Conservative minister, get up in the House of Commons and say, we are proposing to... I think that is doing tremendous damage to our reputation for probity, for upholding the rule of law. And I don't see how we can reproach Russia or Iran or China for the behaviour in which they engage, which falls below international standards, if we ourselves are paying such scant regard to our very recently signed up to treaty obligations.
You have former Prime Ministers Tony Blair, Sir John Major in the papers suggesting that Boris Johnson is bringing shame on the country. Do you think the Prime Minister shames the country in this?
Well, those are their words, not mine, but I made
what would you call it?
Pretty strongly. And I think it is doing great damage to our reputation, and I think it is a very bad piece of legislation.
We had Robert Buckland was laying out the reasons for this, that this was because of an interpretation of the Withdrawal Act that could see in theory, indeed the Prime Minister suggested it yesterday, food blockades between Great Britain and Northern Ireland produced by the European Union. They've denied that. Do you accept that that is a risk here?
Well, I don't know whether it's a risk because I'm not party to the negotiations. But what Robert Buckland didn't deal with is this fact. The withdrawal agreement itself provides a way of resolving disputes. Not only does it provide a way of resolving disputes, there's an article in the withdrawal agreement to which this country signed up, which says that the way prescribed in the agreement for resolving disputes is the only way which the parties would use. So there is a procedure built into the withdrawal agreement for resolving disputes.
And why do you think the government's avoiding that?
Sorry?
Why do you think the government is avoiding that route?
I have no idea. That's a question you have to ask the government. But that's what they should be doing. If, as they say, the European Union is acting in bad faith. If, as they say, the European Union is putting on the treaty an extreme interpretation, the agreement itself provides the route to resolve those disagreements.
On the point of whether or not this is going to get through the House of Lords, I wonder. You've said you're not voting for it. Are you actively working to prevent this going through the House of Lords?
Well, I've made my views plain. I'm not organising any resistance.
No skullduggery.
I've spoken in the House of Lords. I've given a number of interviews. When it comes to the Lords, I expect to speak in the debate. People will no doubt listen to what I say and either agree or disagree with it.
What do you think this does for public perception of the Conservative Party, a party that has in the previously said it is the party of law and order?
I think it damages that reputation. That's one of the reasons why I'm so concerned about it.
But there doesn't seem to be a way around this. I mean, at the moment, if it's not going to make it through the Lords, there's going to have to be another mechanism, presumably, possibly through that joint committee or something else, to try and safeguard this.
Well, the withdrawal agreement, as I've said, provides the way in which disputes can be resolved. And those procedures are there for a reason. They were signed up to by this Prime Minister and this government less than a year ago, and they should be used.
Mm-hmm. What Boris Johnson has sold this deal as great for Britain, as a way in which we can unite in our destinies, our shared destinies he talked about. Do you think that has now shown to be, if not a lie, then misleading?
Well, there is a complete inconsistency between what he said when the agreement was signed and what he's saying about it now. I think I would put it in that way.
So, but no suggestion that is that he knew that he was getting it wrong back then when saying that the deal was great.
Well, he knew what he was signing up to. This is a serious international treaty, and prime ministers, before they sign up to international treaties,
yes,
are intended to are meant to get to grips with what the treaty is.
So the conclusion you can come to then, if he knew about it but presented it as something that it perhaps wasn't and knew, then then it was deliberate and it was missold and it was done on, well, not a lie but misleadingly deliberate.
I can't see into the Prime Minister's mind, so I don't know what was in his mind when he signed the agreement. All I'm doing is reading the agreement and seeing what it provides, and I think that agreement should be respected.
Lord Howard, thank you for your time. Lord Michael Howard, former leader of the Conservative Party, Home Secretary from 1993 to 1997. 25 past 11. Let's come to your calls. Here's Callum in Preston this morning. Hi, Callum.
Hi, Tom. How are you doing?
Yes, good, thank you, sir. Your thoughts on where we are this hour?
Yeah, I'm just disappointed that the Justice Secretary's gone, actually, because I would have liked to have asked him myself whether he would have thought it was acceptable for me to have a dinner party on Tuesday with 8 people, because obviously, there'd be a bit of a conflict between my own desires and the law, but I'd only be breaking the law in a specific and limited way, of course. So, would that be acceptable? And if not, why is it acceptable for him and his pals in government to break the law, yet not acceptable for me to have 2 more people round to my home? It's a complete and utter disgrace. It just seems as though law and order does not apply to this government. It's been like this from the beginning with the prorogation of Parliament, the whole Dominic Cummings affair. It's just one thing after another, and I just think we're heading towards the end of the transition period, and we've got a trade deal with Japan, which is wonderful that we've managed to get a deal. But who else is going to want to make a deal with us? Who is going to want to sign up to an agreement with a country who so openly and so publicly gloats about the fact that we're happy to break international agreements? It's a complete joke.
I don't know. It's interesting you call it gloating. I think the Justice Secretary seemed a bit more chastened by it. I mean, some have already argued that as a result of this, he should resign because he's stood up to uphold the rule of law and he's not being able to do that at the moment. But you're right, it's either a question of trust with other nations about signing future agreements, or it's just a question of competence, isn't it? The real thing for me is do the government know what it is that they're signing up to?
I feel like the Prime Minister just sort of, clicked accept terms and conditions without actually reading them. That's how it feels. When you're scrolling through something online and you just click accept at the bottom, and then it comes back to bite you on the bottom later on. I honestly feel like that's what he's done. I mean, don't get me wrong, Theresa May was by no means my favourite person in the world. However, at least she tried to actually adhere to international law, as difficult as it was.
Well, you wouldn't have got, what you wouldn't have got, Callum, thank you, is this kind of disagreement, because there was no front stop with Theresa May's deal. There's a backstop and all the intended consequences of that, but the front stop wouldn't have been there. So this, in theory, wouldn't have been a problem with Theresa May's deal. Callum, thank you. Let's go to Michael, who's in Swindon this morning. Hiya, Michael.
Good morning. Didn't Boris Johnson say that nothing was settled until everything was settled? The Americans are siding with the Irish once again, who are siding with Europe because they want to stay in Europe.
Nothing was agreed until everything was agreed, it was the line. But the withdrawal agreement has been agreed. It's been signed into law by both the EU Parliament and ours.
It's still an agreement that the foreigners are always breaking their agreements.
The foreigners? Yeah. Michael, come on, man. The foreigners.
America's...
What do you mean?
...is siding with Ireland against England. The Europeans are destabilising England by facilitating the flood of immigrants into England.
Oh God, Michael!
By
the way, I will sigh because your use of the verb to flood just isn't borne out by any of the statistics, I'm afraid. And the idea that there are difficulties with how you deal amongst the EU states with this, but the idea that they're sending them all our way isn't true. And the point is that the withdrawal agreement has been agreed. It's been signed up to. It's been ratified. It's done. You can't just, or could you, Michael, suggest that Boris Johnson is merely looking to try and protect Britain from consequences of something that he agreed with?
I think Boris Johnson is making a negotiation. And for the Americans to try and destabilise it.
I don't know why you're caught up on the Americans. Honestly, I know what Nancy Pelosi has said, and that's their view, but I don't know why you're making it about them or about the Irish or about the EU or about people trying to come into this country. It's about the terms hang on a sec. It's about the terms that were agreed by this Prime Minister on a changing of a deal that Theresa May had negotiated and he didn't like, that he suggested wrapped a suicide vest around Brexit or around the country, that he tried to diffuse by basically, let's not beat around the bush, blinking first when it came to putting a customs border down the Irish Sea and just said, no, we're not going to be doing it. And this is the consequence. It's the breaking of international law. You might be fine with it, though, Michael.
Yeah, now they're trying to get us to give in without no... A deal is when you get something, you have a deal. They want to take.
But we did. We signed it. The Prime Minister of this country, the government of this country, agreed with the deal that it signed up to.
Well, that's what he's trying to do. It's not him that's threatening war. It's the Irish saying that if we break any form of agreement, there'll be destabilisation.
Who's threatening war, man? Nobody is threatening war. Michael, thank you. 0345, I tell you what, it's lovely to be back on Brexit, isn't it? Because sometimes you get all sorts. 0345 6060 973 is the number, 84850 to text. You can tweet at LBC. Plus, after the news headlines...
Only testing people with symptoms, you're missing the majority of people. Even if these tests are not fully accurate, enough of them are accurate enough to make it sensible, to make them available.
You can't keep him out of the headlines, can you? Former Prime Minister Tony Blair in the papers and also on LBC, speaking to our own Ruth Davidson on her new show, An Inconvenient Ruth, saying that we must start testing everybody. We'll hear from her. And
the only thing that we recommend now for other countries like the UK is that you've really got to be very prudent and careful as you open up the economy, because if you don't, you're going to start to see the surges that we saw in the United States.
He has the ear and faces the ire of President Donald Trump. His coronavirus advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci, in an exclusive interview on this programme in a few moments' time. Tom Swarbrick here, 11:31. News headlines now. Bill Overton.
The Justice Secretary's hinted he'll resign if the government ends up breaking the law in a way he finds unacceptable. Robert Buckland's described plans to get round anomalies in the Brexit withdrawal agreement as a break-the-glass in emergency provision, if needed. Two former Prime Ministers, John Major and Tony Blair, have written in the Sunday Times it's a shameless move and threatens peace in Northern Ireland. Police say they've had to shut down a series of illegal parties overnight ahead of tougher coronavirus restrictions taking effect tomorrow. The government's written to care homes to highlight the latest rise in cases and for them to take action to prevent further outbreaks. The weather mostly fine and dry with some warm sunshine across England and Wales today. Scotland and Northern Ireland starting with some heavy rain, but things should be drier and brighter later. A high today of 26 degrees.
This is LBC, live from Westminster. Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850.
Morning to you, Swarbrick on Sunday here on LBC. Hope we find you very well. We'll speak in a moment to Mark Drakeford, First Minister of Wales, on the news that the Welsh Government is wanting around 30% of workers in the country to be able to regularly work from or near home, even after the coronavirus crisis is over. We'll speak to Mr. Drakeford in a few moments' time. Let's come to your calls first on what you've heard regarding Brexit this morning. Simon is in Orpington. Morning to you, Simon.
Tom, good morning. Hope you're well. Tom, I wasn't in favour of the withdrawal agreement for the reasons of the issues between the mainland and Northern Ireland, and also the level playing field on state aid. I didn't understand why we should delegate that ability to the EU. But the arguments I'm hearing this morning just seem to be, well, Boris shouldn't have signed it in the first place then. But that's not the answer. The question is, knowing where we are, what should Boris do? And all he's doing is taking away the threat of the ability for the EU to restrict our trade of foods into the island of Northern Ireland.
I actually agree. Yeah, listen, Simon, to an extent, I agree with you, and the practical politics of this are, as you say, if it is indeed the case, and I'm afraid right now I'm not sure how much people trust what the Prime Minister is telling us about what the EU might be threatening to do. If that is the case, what should Britain do in order to remedy that? And I guess people like yourself might say, well, it is an unfortunate consequence of all of this that we have to break international law to protect Britain.
Yes, again, I don't know where we get by just saying, well, I'm not sure I believe Boris and I'd rather believe the EU over Boris Johnson. Again, I don't know where we get with that. I think we have to trust our Prime Minister that if he says...
Difficult though, isn't it? I mean, it's difficult though when that same Prime Minister... It's difficult when that same Prime Minister has said that this is a deal that will safeguard Britain, that it's a deal that we can have shared destinies. He's gone around parading this thing, understandably, before an election, but that was playing politics with it.
Yeah, I think what we need to understand with the withdrawal agreement is it's made up of two parts. The transition period, which is what we're in now, which is set in law, and the political declaration. The political declaration was an outline of our future relationship and was going to become the basis of a free trade agreement. And that's what we're working on now. So naturally, it's going to be a bit woolly and there's areas that they need clarification.
But that's not the bit that's containing...
But our government would point, Tom, I understand what you're saying, but our government would point to Clause 5 about the good faith and say, hang on, the EU aren't acting in good faith by not putting us as a third country for food stuff so we can just have our foods pass to and fro to Northern Ireland. So they would say, well, they're not exercising good faith. Therefore, to take away the threat of a blockade between the mainland and Northern Ireland, we're going to bring in this deal.
Right.
Again, it's
Simon,
not...
We're going to have to leave it there, mate. But I appreciate the call. Thank you, and you make the point passionately. And I do wonder whether the calculation in number 10 at all of this is interesting. The use of Robert Buckland, or rather Robert Buckland's use of the word tactic in describing what some of this might be seen as. I wonder whether number 10 might hear what Simon is saying and think, do you know what? That's precisely the view we want people to have. 0345 6060 973. Come back to your calls in just a moment. 11:38 is the time. As I mentioned, around 30% of workers in Wales should be able to regularly work from or near home even after the coronavirus crisis is over. This is according to the Welsh Government, who want to see this brought in. Mark Drakeford is the First Minister of Wales. Joins me live on Swarbrick on Sunday this morning. Thank you for your time this morning, Mr. Drakeford. Why do you want to do this?
Because although coronavirus has been an awful experience, there are some good things that we have learned through it, and we want to capture that learning. So we have learned in the Welsh Government that we are able to operate absolutely effectively with a large majority of our workers working from home or working remotely closer to home. And when coronavirus is over, we do not want to go back to the days where 2,000 people try to travel to our office in Cardiff at 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the morning and all leave again at 5 o'clock in the evening.
What happens
to allow that learning to be captured?
What happens, though, sorry to interrupt, to the economies in those cities, the bus networks, the trains, the coffee shops, the restaurants, the cafes, the bars. What happens to them? They're going to be hit massively by this.
Well, I must say, I do think that sounds to me very much like the tail wagging the dog. We're not going to organise the way we work in the future to keep cafes open where they are now. Those businesses will alter and adapt. We know already in some parts of Europe where people are working far more from home, those cafes and restaurants that opened in city centres have relocated out to places where people live and still need those services. But the impact on pollution, the impact on air quality, the impact on quality of life and work-life balance, all of those can be improved by capturing some of the things we've learnt over the last months.
What about the issues that people have with regular working from home? And I'd be interested to get your assessment of what regular should mean in this context. But that people don't have access to other colleagues very well, that they don't get the office culture, that opportunities might be missed because they're not in with the boss or near their staff member, that the chances of mental health problems increase if you're working from home and working remotely all the time.
Now, look, that's a really important point, and I want to be clear, what we're talking about is a sort of blended approach to work. We're not talking about 30% of people working at home all the time. We're talking that at any one time, 30% of people will be working from home. People will be working in our hubs that we are going to develop in towns in Wales, closer to where people live. Some days of the week, they'll be working from home at other days of the week. You're right, people do need time face-to-face with their colleagues. There is a well-being and mental health component, but that doesn't mean coming back to work 9 to 5, 5 days a week in the pattern that we were so used to before.
And just give us the detail of what these community-based remote working hubs would look like. Is it? I'm imagining a kind of internet cafe with lots of people sitting there and working.
Yeah, very much like that, but shared spaces between public services, private businesses, third sector organisations, flexible spaces where people can book in and use sometimes, meeting spaces where those will be needed, but in the communities where people live and where those services are delivered.
Great to talk to you. Thank you for your time this morning. Mark Drakeford, First Minister of Wales, on the proposals to get around 30% of workers to be able to regularly work from home. Let's come back to your calls on Brexit. Here's Craig in Glasgow this morning. Hiya, Craig.
Hi, Tom. Good morning to you.
Morning.
I think, I've listened to your programme this morning. I've heard Robert Jenrick and for me, I just think...
Well, Mr. Buckland. Mr. Jenrick hasn't appeared yet on the programme, but Robert Buckland,
I got the wrong Robert. No, I think I can understand the UK wanting to protect itself and its market. I get that. I do. The problem is that for me, Boris Johnson delivered this deal, signed it himself, campaigned on it, and this is the key part. He campaigned on the back of this being an oven-ready deal. Now, to be clear, because I think it seems to get lost, and you'd mentioned it to the Labour MP that was on as well, no one's trying to block Brexit because you can't block something that's been done. We've left the EU. That's done.
No, agreed. But what it, from those people who are okay with this, say, this is blocking Britain's chance to protect itself from the most extreme and apparently unforeseen consequences of the Withdrawal Act.
Yeah, I get that, but then I feel that the issue I have is that we're only in this situation because of how poorly the trade talks have gone since the withdrawal agreements went through, and we have to accept that part of that falls on the shoulders of the British government as well, because I feel like...
It does, you're right, but to what extent does that fall on the part of the EU too? They're also involved in these negotiations.
It does, but I think the problem is you've had two, in my opinion, two super egos in Boris Johnson and Michel Barnier at loggerheads, trying to one-up each other, which isn't helping anybody, to be frank. But the issue is, I think, we went to the negotiating table initially, I think, with quite a hostile attitude after the withdrawal agreement. I think the approach, and I was not someone who was a supporter of Theresa May, but I think the approach Theresa May took was a more sensible approach than Boris Johnson's approach of, we want you to give us everything, we don't really want to give you all that much in return. And by the same measure, the EU and Michel Barnier is almost trying to say the same thing. So you need, I think, somebody perhaps like a Theresa May or somebody more sensible to get in the middle of these two and actually almost bang their heads together, because it's.
Well, that would be. I mean, Craig, we are. Yeah, no. I mean, we are. In extraordinary times. That really would be extraordinary that the former Prime Minister put herself into those negotiations again. Craig, thank you for the call. There is some suggestion, though, that Theresa May might be the one to lead the rebels in the House of Commons over this. I saw David Gauke, the former Justice Secretary, arguing that point yesterday. We'll wait and see. Come back to your calls in a few moments' time on this too. Plus,
testing people who without symptoms is an important part of the public health endeavor and should be pursued.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, the Trump COVID advisor, on the programme, exclusive interview about what America has got right and wrong and his relationship with the President of the United States. You're listening to Swarbrick on Sunday. Tom Swarbrick here. It's 11:45. Here's Ali. Tom Johnson will be solely responsible for the breakup of the United Kingdom. He knew in February what he was doing. The plan was put it on the back burner and we'll bully the EU later and blame them, says Ali. Keep your calls coming in. We'll be joined by Lord Gavin Barwell after the news at 12 o'clock to get his thoughts on what is coming to the House of Lords. But given that there are changes in this country to how we fight the coronavirus, I was delighted earlier in the week to speak to Trump's COVID advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who has gained worldwide recognition for trying to manage the US and the US president through the coronavirus crisis in the United States. We talked about Trump, we talked about his relationship with him, which has been very difficult. We talked about masks, and we talked about the UK's response in dealing with this. But I started by asking Dr. Fauci how soon we can expect a vaccine.
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic that we will be successful in getting a vaccine, and likely more than one candidate, because there's a number of candidates that are being tested not only in the United States, but in other countries throughout the world, including the UK. So my feeling is that by the time we get to the end of this calendar year, November, December, we likely will know whether we have a safe and effective vaccine or more than one vaccine. There are 3 candidates, including one from the UK, that are being tested right now in the United States in a phase 3 trial. And we hope that by the end of this year, we'll get enough results to be able to make a determination whether it's safe and effective. And then there are 2 or 3 other candidates that are close behind that will go into advanced trials at the end of September, at the end of October. So I think things are looking pretty optimistic about the likelihood of our being successful one way or the other in the next several months.
Is it the case that the vaccine trials that are happening at the University of Oxford, are they the furthest ahead, as it were? Are they sort of leading the pack? And to what extent are you concerned about the news that that trial has had to be paused?
Well, I wouldn't say they were leading the pack. I would say they were right up there with others. The advantage they had, that they have had tests in South America, in Brazil, and in South Africa, in which there's a lot of infections. So the likelihood that they would have gotten a result reasonably soon is in fact true. So in that respect, you could say they were ahead. The issue now is something that is one of those things that's just the reality of vaccine trials. They ran into a serious adverse event and they did the appropriate thing. They put the trial on hold, which means that there will be no more enrollment until they figure this out.
But
and
I wonder
hopefully,
I wonder if that sort of blunts. Sorry to interrupt, Doctor. I wonder if that blunts your optimism, though, because of course these sort of these events could happen. The bumping up into problems could continue to happen, and obviously push that date back a bit.
Well, you know, it doesn't blunt my optimism for the simple reason that this is one of 6 or 7 trials that are ongoing right now. I think it will slow down, hopefully only temporarily, the AstraZeneca trial until they figure it out, and then hopefully they'll be able to proceed. But when you have 6 or 7 candidates and one gets slowed down, the entire field doesn't get slowed down because the others are right on course.
A lot of people are concerned at the speed at which this is progressing. As much as it is great that we're racing towards getting a vaccine, people worry about corners being cut, they worry about safety. What would you say to those people who say right now that they wouldn't accept a vaccine if it were to become available soon?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to point out, and what you just brought up about the hold on the AstraZeneca trial is a good example that we do have good checks and balances, and that's the reason why you go through various phases in a trial. We are going quickly, but it's important to point out that the speed by no means compromises safety, nor does it compromise scientific integrity. The speed is based on the extraordinary advances in technology that have occurred over the last 10 years or so, where we went from just recognizing a new virus in the first week of January to being able to go into a phase 1 trial a couple of months later and a phase 3 trial only 6 or 7 months later. That is unprecedented.
So you wouldn't be concerned, you personally obviously wouldn't be concerned about taking a vaccine were it to become available.
No.
Do you think the President of the United States would?
Well, I'm not sure what he would do. I wouldn't want to speak for him, but I can tell you that the process that now
I'm just interested in the idea, Dr. Fauci, that it's questionable about whether the President would take the vaccine, perhaps.
Well, I don't know if it's questionable. He might. You just have to ask him.
I'd love to.
I can tell you. Yeah, well, I'll ask him the next time I see him, if you would like. But the fact is that given the process of the safety and efficacy trials that are going on right now, if, let's say, at the end of this year, November and December, that the regulatory authorities in the United States or in England or in the EU say that a vaccine or more than one vaccine is safe and effective, I can tell you personally, I would not hesitate to take the vaccine, nor would I hesitate to recommend that my family take the vaccine.
We've had a difficult week in the UK when it comes to case numbers increasing. We've seen a daily increase of nearly 3,000 cases a day over the last few, and there's a legal change coming in on Monday to say that gatherings of no more than 6 people are now going to be made illegal in many circumstances. I wonder if you think that that's a sign that the UK perhaps opened up rather too soon.
You know, I think we have to be careful in blaming a decision. You know, we had the same problem in the United States. I'm sure you followed it, where we had a big surges in the northeastern part of the country with the New York metropolitan area, which accounted for almost 50% of all the infections and hospitalizations and deaths in the country. Then their curve came way down. Then the southern states of Florida, Texas, California, and Arizona, they began to do what the UK is doing now. They tried to open up the economy. And maybe they did it a little bit too quickly. Maybe they did it a little bit too aggressively. But we saw a big surge in cases in the southern states that went from maybe 20,000 a day way up to 70,000 a day. So we had the same problem. So the only thing that we recommend now for other countries like the UK is that you've really got to be very prudent and careful as you open up the economy, because if you don't, you're going to start to see the surges that we saw in the United States and that apparently you are seeing right now in the UK.
Do you think then that this is over caution from the UK government, given what we've seen over the last, certainly in March and April time, that they're being more cautious than perhaps might be warranted given the case numbers that exist at the moment, no?
No, I don't think they're being overcautious, but what I think they are doing, at least from what I'm gathering from my side of the pond, is that what they're doing is that they are being now more prudent in saying, we're going to continue to try and open up, but we got to do it much more carefully.
I wonder what you make broadly of how the UK has handled this, because if you look at excess deaths across Europe, the UK unfortunately is almost leading the pack when it comes to the number of the extra number of people who have died as a result of this. How would you characterize the UK's response broadly?
You know, it's very interesting because I get asked that a lot about our response here in the United States almost every day. And you could always have done better. I think what the UK did in the beginning, they thought that perhaps they would go the herd immunity route and let there be infections to try and that didn't work. But they were smart enough to say, wait a minute, we got to reverse our strategy. And then I think they did as well as anyone could expect. It's so easy to criticize retrospectively about what you could have done better. I think if you look at the entire planet and all the different countries, most of countries had a problem that if they look back at it, they say they could have done better. So I'm always reluctant to make any kind of critique of what people could have done. Hopefully, looking forward, they'll do much better.
Well, here's hoping. I mean, the Prime Minister has said that he's been guided by the science during this. And you mentioned about herd immunity and the so-called change of strategy that there was. speaking as a scientist as you do, I wonder how good a guide the science has been during this.
The science has been a good guide. What I think people need to appreciate is that we started from knowing nothing about this. This was a brand new virus. And as the weeks and months went by, we got information that was real data and real evidence. And you have to, in real time, act on the information you have.
But that changed views, didn't it? That changed approaches. When it comes to masks or testing or social distancing, the science moved as it knew more, which is understandable.
Well, exactly, and that's my point, because you have to make changes in your policy and your guidelines based on the most recent and well-founded evidence and data. So when the general public, I know the United States public felt the same way, I'm sure in the UK it was similar, when they see changes in recommendations or guidelines, they get confused and say, well, wait a minute, you said this a month ago, why are you saying this now? And the reason is because the evidence is evolving and the evidence is changing, and you have to be flexible enough and humble enough and realizing that you do have to change as the evidence accumulates. And that's what we did in the United States, and I'm sure that's what you're doing in the UK.
I'm cautiously optimistic that Dr. Anthony will be successful
in getting a vaccine.
Speaking to me a little earlier this week, you can hear much more from the doctor about his relationship with President Trump after the news at 12 o'clock, and as well as after the news at 12 o'clock. Coming up,
it's very difficult to see how you can negotiate a free trade agreement when what has already been agreed is being proposed to be breached less than 9 months later.
Robert Buckland says the Prime Minister's determined to get a trade deal with the EU, but his Irish counterpart, Helen McEntee, says the internal market bill's been made even harder as a result of the changes that the government is proposing. Loads of you want to have your say on what this means for the UK, whether or not this does mean that the UK's reputation is being slammed, as many lawyers have told the Attorney General, Suella Braverman. We'll hear too from Tony Blair, who says Johnson has shamed the UK. You'll hear more from the former Prime Minister about his time in number 10 as well. It's all after the news at 12.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
Very good afternoon to you. Just gone midday. You are listening to and possibly even watching as well Swarbrick on Sunday. New programme here on LBC, 10 a.m. till 1 every Sunday morning. Great to have your company on what has been a very, very busy weekend. We'll hear in a few moments' time more from Dr. Anthony Fauci, President Trump's coronavirus advisor, about his relationship with the president, what it's like inside the Oval Office when he has to deliver bad news to the President of the United States. We'll speak to Ruth Davidson as well, the former leader of the Conservative Party in the Scottish Parliament. She has a new show here on LBC, An Inconvenient Ruth. It's on at 9 p.m. tonight. Her first guest is the former Prime Minister Tony Blair, who is, well, frankly, it's hard to keep him out the news at the moment. He's in the papers this morning, completely slamming the Prime Minister for having to break international law to put right something he should have known about when he got the Brexit deal in the first place. We'll speak to Lord Gavin Barwell, a man who helped make a deal with the European Union, former Chief of Staff to Theresa May, the former Prime Minister, of course. We'll speak to Dominic Grieve, a former Attorney General as well. I first, though, put it to Robert Buckland, the Justice Secretary, that the bill that is to be introduced and is going through the House of Lords at the moment does break international law. Take a listen.
It has the potential of creating a conflict with Article 4 protocol. That is, well, it creates a conflict, but we do not want to get there. What we need to do is have an insurance policy if the joint committee, that is the committee that's been set up to agree the operation of the protocol, if the talks break down without agreement. This is a break glass in emergency provision. We don't want to do it. We don't want to have to implement them. And if we are in that position, we will work very, very rapidly and earnestly to get out of it.
Robert Buckland, the Justice Secretary, speaking to me a little earlier this morning. Let's turn to Dominic Grieve, former Attorney General and, of course, former Conservative MP. Thank you for coming on the line this morning, Mr. Grieve. Your successor, Suella Braverman, has been given apparently an ear-bashing by lawyers at a Bar Council meeting, suggesting that Britain couldn't retain a shred of credibility in imploring other countries to follow international law if Britain breaks them. Do you think that that is what Britain is doing, shredding its credibility?
Yes, I'm afraid it is. The illegality, the unlawfulness kicked in on the day that the government published this bill with the clauses in which override their treaty obligations. It's a breach of faith, it's bad faith, that is contrary to international law. And I'm afraid the arguments that it's possible to do this as some sort of reserve to fall back on cannot be justified as a matter of law at all. The government really has some deep reason to believe that the European Union is going to misapply the treaty which Boris Johnson freely signed up to only 11 months ago. Well, then in those circumstances, he should firstly negotiate. And if indeed this terrible happening, which he says is going to happen, were to come to pass, then he might have some moral justification in trying to do something about it. But at present, there is neither a moral nor legal justification for it whatsoever.
Well, the justification that they've got is it takes two to tango in this negotiation, and the EU is, as the Prime Minister suggested in the paper on Saturday, the EU is potentially able to place a food blockade, stop food being moved between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That is something that a Prime Minister of Great Britain cannot countenance.
Firstly, the Prime Minister signed up to this agreement with advice. I have to say that some of us pointed out a year ago that there was a potential problem about maintaining the union of the United Kingdom and about the risks that might flow from tariffs and regulatory checks at the border.
And that's all true, Mr. Grieve. And you've been proven
for a second referendum.
You have been proven right on that.
Yeah,
but at the same time, sorry to interrupt, but at the same time, we are where we are with this. Are we expecting now, once the mistake has been made, do we expect the Prime Minister to just say, well, I've made a mistake that could endanger the trading of the United Kingdom as a single entity, so I'm not going to do anything about it? Or should he seek to remedy it?
Firstly, I haven't seen a slightest shred of independent evidence that the EU intends to do any such thing. I've been struck by the fact that this week the government has been saying stopping food. There's no question of stopping food. There might be regulatory checks, which we don't want. So to begin with, I'm afraid I don't believe the government what it says. I'm afraid the Prime Minister is such a dishonest individual. I've ceased to take at face value anything he says. So I think we should be very careful about swallowing this particular government line. But secondly, it doesn't get you away from the problem that the decision to do this in a negotiation with a group of partners who we would describe as probably our most trusted partners on this planet has reputational consequences for the country, which are going to be very bad indeed. Not just abstract bad, but really bad in terms of the other agreements we might be wanting to do either with them or with others. And that's why lawyers have got so exercised about it. And the government's explanations for doing it, I'm afraid, simply don't stack up.
Former Attorney General Dominic Grieve joining us live on the programme this morning. Thank you for your time. Let's turn to Lord Gavin Barwell, former Conservative MP, former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Theresa May between 2017 and 2019. Good to have you on the programme this morning, Lord Barwell. First question to you, are you going to vote for this?
I would find it very difficult to vote for something that was breaching our international law obligations.
What do you think can change between now and when you cast your vote to mean that you would be able to vote for it?
Well, so I think we should be clear, first of all, Tom, the difference between the bill as a whole and these particular provisions. So the bill as a whole, I think, is absolutely necessary. Just to take a moment to explain what's happening here is, as powers are returned from the EU to the UK, and they're going to go to, in many cases, to the devolved governments, we need to make sure that we don't see barriers emerge within our United Kingdom that break up our own internal market. So the bill as a whole, I think there is a case for. The problem, I think, is twofold. One, the government, I don't think, has done a very good job of bringing the devolved governments with them in making the case for the bill, but that, I think, is soluble. The real issue here is these additional measures that have been put in that are clearly in breach of the commitments that we made in the withdrawal agreement. And the best way to get out of this mess is to agree a deal with the European Union. You just made a very fair point to Dominic. A number of us warned the Prime Minister at the time that he did this deal what the consequences could be, and that they would be much worse in a no-deal environment than in a deal environment. And so the best way of resolving this situation is to get a deal with the EU on our future trading relationship, because that will make the operation of the protocol much better. But it also helps in lots of other ways as well. One of the things that I think everyone needs to bear in mind here is not just the damage that is going to be done to our relationship with the EU, our trading and security relationship, the damage that could be done to the peace process in Northern Ireland. But if we go ahead on this course that the government has set out, we lose the possibility of a trade deal with the United States, and we do much wider damage to our international reputation. And I think we also hand a huge weapon to Nicola Sturgeon and others that want to break up our country. So I don't see any win if the government continues on this course.
So on that basis then, Lord Barwell, you don't think this is going to get through the House of Lords unamended or
it's
in this form?
Not for me to predict how other people are going to vote, but what I would say to you, Tom, is the thing that has really struck me over the last few days is the range of opposition. So you've had someone like John Major who never wanted Brexit to happen, wanted a second referendum, but people like Lord Howard and Lord Lamont, who are staunch Brexiteers, also voicing very strong opposition to what the government is doing. And I hope that will make the government think again and see that this is not people that are necessarily trying to stop the policy that the overall policy they're embarked on. This is a wide range of opinion across the political spectrum that is very worried about the damage to the UK that will follow if we carry on down this road.
You have spent many, many hours inside EU Council buildings and inside the negotiations and getting into the detail of the deal that Theresa May agreed with the European Union. I wonder what you make of the claim from the government now that the European Union may well seek to produce a sort of food blockade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Do you see that as a genuine risk?
Well, I haven't seen any evidence of that, but I think there is absolutely a very serious risk of significant barriers to trade across the Irish Sea with trade going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. And that's exactly why Theresa didn't want to do this deal. That's why she worked so hard to get out of this Northern Ireland only arrangement to something that was a broader UK-wide arrangement. And when the Prime Minister signed this deal in the autumn, myself and lots of other people said, look, we will vote for it very reluctantly because it's now the only option on the table. But this is the problem with this deal, and it's going to be a much bigger problem if we don't then get a trade deal secured with the EU. And I think a final point, Tom, I think for many of your listeners who have probably thought Brexit had been done and put to bed and were fed up with this endless wrangling over this issue, what they want this government to do is focus on the pandemic. That's the real threat to our well-being and prosperity at the moment that we face. And the last thing we need to do is reopen up all of these Brexit wounds. So I think what the government needs to do is find a way to get to a deal with the EU and not press ahead with these proposals that are going to damage our reputation, that are going to also damage our prospects of getting a deal with the US, and that are just going to hand ammunition to the people who are trying to break up our country.
Lord Barwell, Gavin Barwell, thank you for your time. Former Conservative MP, former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Theresa May between 2017 and 2019. Very keen to get your thoughts on all of this. 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850. You can tweet at LBC, presumably on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube. You can leave comments there too. Keen to get to hear from as many of you as possible on this. After the news headlines,
you're always in this situation when you're in the public eye of it being inevitable, and one part of you understands that and another part of you semi-resents it, but I came to the conclusion in the end you just had to live with it.
Former Prime Minister Tony Blair on his time in office, speaking exclusively to LBC's Ruth Davidson, former leader of the Conservative Party in Scotland, who has her own show, 9 p.m. on LBC. We'll bring you more details of what Tony Blair has said after the news at 12:30. Tom Swarbrick here, 12:15.
This is LBC. Swarbrick on Sunday, live from Westminster on LBC.
Afternoon to you. Lord Barwell mentioned there at the end of my interview with him about the government getting back to the business of dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. There's an issue in care homes again, I'm afraid, certainly according to the Sunday Times. We'll speak to Ben Kentish about that in a few moments. Let's get your calls on Brexit, though. Here's Dennis in Southwark this afternoon. Hiya, Dennis.
Hello.
Your thoughts on what the government is planning on doing?
The main point that seems to be being made by government spokespeople is that this needs to be some sort of insurance policy, or indeed even an emergency thing that you have to bang and say we're in an emergency. We're not in an emergency right now. We still think we can get a deal. We will know within a few weeks, perhaps by the 15th of October, certainly by the end of October, whether or not we've got a deal. Then there would be plenty of time to put through any kind of emergency legislation that seemed to be necessary, bearing in mind exactly the situation at the end of the negotiations. There is no need whatsoever to do this now, and as someone coming from Northern Ireland, I'm very concerned about the situation there. I think it is a crazy thing to do.
I was going to. I heard your accent, Dennis, and I did wonder how you would feel about. Well, certainly the Prime Minister's suggestion that there's a blockade coming, that the EU could use this to take it to he used the word extreme conclusion and provide a barrier between GB and NI, a barrier which I'm afraid the Prime Minister did basically negotiate as a result of getting rid of the backstop.
Well, he did, but I think it's absolute nonsense. This idea of treating the EU as if they were some ogres who are only wanting to rend us apart is nonsense. In almost any agreement, there can be some way that somebody could completely misuse it. But we've got to have some trust here. And I think the fact that there would be an element of checking in the Irish Sea in order to stop there being any kind of need for a border in Ireland, unfortunately, is essential. And it can be done, and the businesses in Northern Ireland are ready to do it, but they just don't know what to prepare for because everything is changing.
Quite, and I'm afraid the issue of trust is going to be diminished between the EU and the UK if the UK presses ahead with this, certainly according to the EU. But again, I'm interested in that term that Robert Buckland used, the word tactic, to describe all this. Dennis, thank you. Let's come to Richard in Merthyr Tydfil. Hiya, Richard.
Yeah, hi, Tom.
Hello.
Tom, as far as I'm concerned, the Prime Minister's got my back, and that's why I vote for him on December the 12th. And I don't care what the political elite, this is the last dying chances that Mr. Howard, Mr. Major, and Mr. Blair have got to try and stop this. We expected this. The last
they can't
few weeks
stop it. It's
October.
happened.
No,
I agree, Richard. Listen, I know that they tried and they wanted a second. They wanted a second referendum, and many people didn't want it to happen. But it's over. We've left.
Yeah, we have left, Tom, and I just wish that the Ramonas would just leave it go. This is what we've got. This is
but
the
Lord
last
Howard is not a Ramona. Michael Howard is a Brexiteer. Norman Lamont is not a Ramona. Norman Lamont is a Brexiteer.
Yeah, one is used to be the ex-leader of the Tory party, and the other one was the worst chancellor we've ever had. So,
right, but they are Brexiteers.
Yeah, to be quite honest with you, I don't care about their opinion. I care about the opinion of the Prime Minister, and that is the end of story. So, Mr. Prime Minister, go ahead. Europe, can't trust them, don't want them, end of story.
Richard, we'll leave it there. Thank you. 0345 6060 973 is the number. Come back to more of your calls in just a moment. 12:22, front page of the Sunday Times. Virus cases in care homes spiral again. This is a leaked document from the Department of Health that circulated on Friday, stated the rate of coronavirus recorded through satellite tests had quadrupled since the start of the month, which now stands at an estimated 1,100 new cases every day. Ben Kentish is LBC's Westminster correspondent. Run us through the figures and how we know that cases are going up again in care.
It's a leaked document, Tom, a very sensitive document, so sensitive, in fact, it's been branded official sensitive at the top of this document, leaked to the Sunday Times, revealing, as you say, that since the start of the month, and we're only 13 days into it, of course, the number of testing positive in care homes has quadrupled, up to 1,100 or so a day. And Matt Hancock, the health secretary, having been told that it is now in 43 care homes. Now, of course, that is a huge cause for concern, given what we saw earlier in the year, 20,000 or more deaths in care homes, partly after patients were discharged from hospitals into those settings without testing. Now, the government promised in July, you might remember, Tom, that every care worker and care home resident would be tested once a week for coronavirus. It took some time, it must be said, to meet that target. They now say they have done met that target in care homes that have asked for regular testing. There are still care homes that haven't and where that isn't going on. What the government say and what the data suggests is that most of those those positive test results that surveillance testing has uncovered are in care workers. But clearly the big concern, and there's already signs of this happening, is that it will then start to spread to care home residents. And the warnings that we've seen from government that the current high number of cases in young people will in time spread to older people, that risks becoming true pretty quickly, I'm afraid.
Yeah, we saw last week care homes in Newcastle, Gateshead and Sunderland shutting their doors to visitors because of worries about an outbreak. I guess that therefore the testing of asymptomatic people is absolutely critical in this, and presumably that is the thing that is informing this Operation Moonshoot that Boris Johnson is talking about, to try and get as many people tested as often as possible to rule out any asymptomatic carriers.
Yes, that's exactly right. That is the longer term plan. That is the way, effectively, if there is going to be a way before a vaccine, that social distancing will end. It will be by testing people to confirm they're negative, whereas at the moment, of course, we're testing to confirm they're positive. But, Tom, there's another story in the Sunday Times, which is almost a more pressing concern than the moonshot plan, which is the current state of testing in the UK.
Yes.
Another leaked document revealing a backlog of 185,000 swabs. There is another issue about delays, 3/4 of tests not being returned within that crucial 24 hours. And then there's a third issue, which is about tests being voided. They're not being done properly. 12,000 a day and one day were voided by one of the testing companies. Interestingly, one of the reasons...
I know what you're going to say, and I just want, if you're having your lunch, just, bear with. But go on.
Am I allowed to say it? One of the reasons given, Tom, they say the main reason is the tests are being lost in transit or damaged in transit. But one reason, according to the Sunday Times, is that rather than sending nasal or throat swabs, some people being tested for COVID-19 have sent in urine samples instead.
Common sense. Ben, thank you very much indeed. LBC, I mean, it is incredibly serious, but that is not a good sign, is it, that people now, and the instructions are very clear about what you have to do. Weeing in it is not part of it. Ben, thank you. LBC's Westminster correspondent Ben Kentish. 12:25, let's come back to your calls. Here's Mary in Hemel Hempstead this afternoon. Hi there, Mary.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
I just want to say that I feel that they've broken the law themselves several times, the EU, with regards to... I can remember CJD, we were put in quarantine, they wouldn't allow us to transport our beef, they said it was unsafe, and yet the French were doing it, and the Germans were doing it, all across borders. They said there were no borders, they wanted no borders when this coronavirus broke out. Italy, suddenly all the borders came up. Was that right and proper? Yeah,
well,
I say
if
good
they
luck,
agreed,
Boris, if he could get away with it, to do it.
So, Mary, you don't like other people doing it, but when we do it, it's okay.
Well, it's a case of what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If they can do it, I don't see why we can't when we're stuck in a situation like this. I'm sure Boris wants a deal. I am not that au fait with Boris, but he's what we've got. But I'm sure he wants to do a deal. But I think it's the intransigence of the EU that is stopping it. They just don't want to let us go, and they're doing everything they can. And people like Major and, what's his name, Blair, I mean, they're both has-beens. I don't know why people even listen to them, because they caused so much chaos to this country when they were in power.
Well, regardless of their records, more of which you'll hear in the moment, they've been proven right, haven't they? I mean, this whole, whether it's the backstop or the front stop in the Irish Sea, this issue of the Irish border is central to making Brexit a reality. And Boris Johnson chose, rather than having the backstop, to have a front stop by putting the possibility of customs borders in the Irish Sea. He's always said it won't happen, but he got a deal ratified by the British Parliament and the Parliament of the European Union and 26 other nations to say that was what was going to happen.
But don't you think all this nonsense about this Irish backstop all started with Theresa May? She was prepared to sign up to anything, and she signed up to it originally, and she should have thrown it out right at the beginning, and we wouldn't have been in this situation.
Well, we would have been in a different situation, you're right. We would have been in the situation of saying, for there to be checks on goods coming across the border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the EU, there would have to be, in theory, some customs checks posts. And the British government had stated...
I can't see what the issue with it is here.
Well, you have to check. You have to check whether the goods coming in are to your standards.
When they come from another country and come through, say, Ireland, the same with us from the start. So I can't really see what the issue is here.
Well, the issue is that
cut off this, that, and the other to us. What are we supposed to do? Say, right, well, we won't buy this, that, and the other from you. It just it'll just rumble on and on and on.
But ultimately, Mary, and Dominic Grieve made the point, and I did put it to Robert Buckland as well. You believe the Prime Minister when he says the EU is threatening the idea of putting in a trade blockade on food between Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
Well, that I'm not sure about, because Boris has not proved to be the most honest.
But this is the part of the. I mean, this is part of the problem, though, Mary, isn't it? You don't know what to believe when the Prime Minister says part of the reason why we're having to do this is because of this, and people go, well, is that true? Is that really happening? And no one can quite say. Mary, thank you. 0345 6060 973 is the number. You can text 84850 as Peter in Lancashire has done. The government hasn't broken any law. Clause 38 was written into the withdrawal agreement, which was signed off both by the EU and by Parliament, including by the Labour Party. It's there to stop us being shafted. You need to read the details before going off on one. But Peter, I'm aware of Clause 38, which does provide provision to break the law if necessary. So yes, there is the specific provision in the withdrawal agreement to break it. But you've actually got to break it. And in breaking the law, you end up breaking it too. So yes, the provision is there to do it. Doesn't mean you have to do it. 0345 6060 973. After the news headlines.
We had a difficulty in the United States because the president, up until recently, has not really been wearing a mask. And even now, he doesn't wear a mask.
The president's COVID advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci, on trying to get the president to wear a mask. And
I don't say I would have done a better job than anyone else, but I just say on this issue of international coordination, I would have been trying, at least, to get that going.
He's not saying he would have done a better job than anyone else, but you'll hear from the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, speaking with Ruth Davidson here on LBC. Tom Swarbrick here, 12:30 is the time. News headlines now. Here's Bill Overton.
This is LBC. Swarbrick on Sunday, live from Westminster. Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850.
Afternoon to you. We'll have the second part of my interview with Dr. Anthony Fauci, the president's coronavirus advisor, about his relationship with Donald Trump, which is, I mean, to use his word, he says it's complicated. Why it's complicated, you'll find out in a few moments if you continue to listen. We'll hear too from Tony Blair, because later on tonight on LBC, he's being interviewed, or has been interviewed, by Ruth Davidson, the leader of the Conservative Party in the Scottish Parliament, who has a new show from 9 p.m. here on LBC. You can get details of what the former Prime Minister has said, and he's everywhere in the papers today. You can get details of what the former Prime Minister has said if you go to lbc.co.uk, lbc.co.uk. We'll provide you with everything you need to know about Tony Blair's interview, what he said about his time in Number 10, what he thinks about the opportunity to deal with coronavirus, how he would go about doing it, lbc.co.uk. The man himself will be heard in full, 9 p.m. here on LBC. Take a listen to what he told our Ruth Davidson.
It's terrifying. I mean, I honestly believe if I was in office back in January, in our time, the links with other leaders would have been sufficiently strong, even with the Trump White House, where you would immediately be coming together on certain core things that all countries will need to get right. So how you share all the best lessons of what works and what doesn't, what's known, what isn't known about the COVID disease. How you accelerate the development of rapid on-the-spot testing, because, you know, we can come to this, testing, in my view, is the only thing that gets you the bridge to a vaccine. How you make sure you develop that vaccine as swiftly as possible, share the lessons of it, and get the distribution of it agreed so that the poorest as well as the wealthiest nations can get access to it. How you make sure that on basic rules around, for example, quarantining and international travel, you're coordinating how you then, as you go into lockdown, as you come out of lockdown, you learn the best lessons, share them, and try and get some uniformity of practice. These are things that are completely obvious to me, and I honestly, for the life of me, don't understand why it's not happened.
Tony Blair speaking to Ruth Davidson, making it sound very easy, doesn't it? Ruth Davidson joins me now, leader of the Conservative Party in the Scottish Parliament, and presenting An Inconvenient Ruth tonight, 9 p.m. here on LBC. Welcome to the programme this afternoon, Ruth. Thank you for being there for us.
Hi, Tom. Delighted. I did challenge him. I did say, look, it sounds as if you're saying if you were still in charge, you'd be doing better than not just Boris and Trump, but Merkel and Macron as well. So he did take that in the spirit, but he certainly had lots of things to say for himself.
Well, yes, I mean, he's, as I mentioned, he's all over the newspapers this morning commenting on the Prime Minister and the Brexit legislation. But I wonder what else he talked about in his time at Number 10 and his life as Prime Minister.
Well, one of the joys of the programme that I'm doing every Sunday now for LBC is that it's a really chunky piece with just one person, so you can get into all aspects of it, not just the job, and people see what the job of a Prime Minister is because they see the press conferences and they see what happens in Parliament, but also the stuff you don't see. What's it like in Number 10? What's it like for your family having an entire country being run in the bit below your flat with the bomb blast doors on it? What's it like to leave? When was the last time you drove a car yourself? Like all of this stuff you don't usually get to ask Prime Ministers and former Prime Ministers. And also, like you say, because he's been very vocal of late, where do you draw the line or make the decision between the first sort of 6, 7, 8 years since he left office, where he didn't say a word, and now when you can never get him off the blooming news?
Quite. It's interesting. I'm going to reveal how sad I am now, Ruth, but I've just finished his book, The Journey, which was my running companion because I got the audio book of it. And one of the things that I thought, having listened to him read it, is I don't think he liked being Prime Minister. I do get the impression that he enjoyed the job.
He says that he probably didn't enjoy it as much as he thinks a Margaret Thatcher or a Boris Johnson would. He always felt the pressure of it. He felt the importance of it, but he wouldn't ever say that he liked it. And we go into some detail about, like I say, what it's like, not just for you, because that's a choice that you make to do, and politicians make that choice on behalf of themselves to put their name on a ballot paper to get elected. But what that's like on the people around you that don't make that decision. His wife never chose to go into politics. She was a lawyer, a better lawyer than him, which is why she rose up the ranks quicker than him when they met in chambers. But she was treated every bit as much scrutiny as he was, even though that wasn't the life she chose for herself.
It's interesting that you, with your background, are speaking to Tony Blair about this, because I wonder whether you agreed with him or disagreed on whether the scrutiny that surrounds politics and politicians at the moment is actually too much and is a barrier to getting people into it.
But I think what we would both agree on, and I'm not sure this is a party political issue, I think there's a lot of people that have been speaking out on this in recent times, is the way in which it's changed, and that social media has completely changed the game. And while it has utterly democratised a lot of what we do, and that's very good, and it gives you immediate access to information, the ways in which you are abused, the way in which things are said about you, your family, that threats are made, that violence is threatened against you. It does take a toll. It takes a toll on mental health, that it changes the game in terms of the way in which you communicate with people, and that it stops this kind of thoughtfulness and sometimes the bipartisanship which previously happens. And that broadly, his view certainly is that that it's basically a plague on your house, and that none of the benefits outweigh the costs to the way in which politics is being conducted right now, and the fact that it puts good people off politics.
And whatever you make of Tony Blair, whatever you think of his legacy, whatever you think is part of his past and his decision-making, it is nevertheless fascinating and important to hear from former Prime Ministers about what it was like in their time in office and what could be done differently. Ruth Davidson, thank you so much. Ruth Davidson, leader of the Conservative Party in the Scottish Parliament and also the presenter of An Inconvenient Ruth, which tonight from 9pm interviews former Prime Minister Tony Blair. Don't miss it. 9pm here on LBC. You can get the details to lbc.co.uk. Let's come to your calls. Here's Mark, new caller in Norwich on the Brexit business. Hi there, Mark.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm very well, sir. Your thoughts on what Boris Johnson is attempting to do here?
Well, I think basically he's just sort of playing to his home crowd, if you like. I mean, using inflammatory words such as blockade, it just doesn't make him sound statesmanlike at all. And I mean, if you examine it, it just doesn't make sense. How can you blockade Northern Ireland? I mean, the EU don't have a navy for a start.
No. I don't think they're literally going to be U-boating the boats down. But there's the technical checks that could be brought in, or the fact that the EU might say, actually, we don't want any of that food stuff anywhere near us, and because Northern Ireland is subject to some EU rules on goods, actually, we're going to keep those goods that you want to put into one part of your own country. We're going to tell you that you can't.
Well, the only reason that they would do that is if the food standards in this country were to drop below the minimum of EU standards.
Is the fact that whatever you think of the EU, it is another state, that the fact that another state could have primacy in deciding what another country moves around its particular parts is not acceptable. You just can't do that.
Well, in normal circumstances, I would tend to agree. But we're not talking normal circumstances when it comes to Northern Ireland.
Yeah, listen, Mark, I just don't think you're going to get many Brexiteers, in fact anybody, whether they wanted this thing to happen or not, saying it's a good place to end up, that position could come about. Mark, listen, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your call. Continue to take more of your calls on this before the news at 1 o'clock. And in a few moments' time, you'll hear the second part of my interview with Dr. Anthony Fauci about the coronavirus outbreak in the United States, about his dealings with President Trump and his relationship with the president, which has, it's fair to say, gone from being pretty good to pretty horrific. You'll hear from Dr. Anthony Fauci exclusively here on LBC. Swarbrick on Sunday, 12:43 is the time.
This is LBC.
Joe in Brighton will come to your call on Brexit in a few moments. But if you are watching us or if you are listening to us in your car or in the kitchen this Sunday afternoon, just carve out a bit of time here because I'm really excited to bring this. This is Dr. Anthony Fauci, Trump's coronavirus advisor, the guy who has been standing next to the president and saying, frankly, entirely contradictory things when the president stands up and says things like he wants to see how much bleach can be injected into people. Dr. Anthony Fauci and I spoke earlier on this week. And this is the second part of the interview in which I asked him whether the science had been a good guide throughout this.
The science has been a good guide. What I think people need to appreciate is that we started from knowing nothing about this. This was a brand new virus. And as the weeks and months went by, we got information that was real data and real evidence. And you have to, in real time, act on the information you have.
But that changed views, didn't it? That changed approaches. When it comes to masks or testing or social distancing, the science moved as it knew more, which is understandable.
Well, exactly, and that's my point, because you have to make changes in your policy and your guidelines based on the most recent and well-founded evidence and data. So when the general public, I know the United States public felt the same way, I'm sure in the UK it was similar, when they see changes in recommendations or guidelines, they get confused and say, well, wait a minute, you said this a month ago, why are you saying this now? And the reason is because the evidence is evolving and the evidence is changing, and you have to be flexible enough and humble enough and realizing that you do have to change as the evidence accumulates. And that's what we did in the United States. And I'm sure that's what you're doing in the UK.
What do you think the UK can learn from the response in the United States?
Oh, well, it's really tough because we have such an interesting situation. We're such a large country and so heterogeneous in so many different ways that we have parts of the country that are doing really well. We refer to them as the green zone. And then you have others that are in between the yellow zones. And then we have the red zones in which you have a lot of infections. So when you look at the United States as a country, you really can't look at it unidimensionally. I mean, there are parts of the United States that are not doing nearly as well as the UK. And there are parts of the United States that are doing much better than the UK.
And do you think that is ultimately because central government, the federal government, is taking the lead, or they've devolved a greater deal of responsibility to state apparatus, and maybe that's a way of that actually the local response, empowering and emboldening a local response to know what's happening on the ground, might be the better process for trying to manage this?
Or it might not be. It might be not the best way. Exactly. In fact, there's a lot of criticism and second guessing in the United States. The United States, by the very nature of how it was founded so many years ago, was on the basis of what we call federalism, which means that the states have a lot of independent say in what they do. In many respects, that's good news because it really, addresses the needs locally. But when you have something that you need a consistent response, often that type of peripheral decision gets you into some difficulty. And I think it has been in some respects negative for the United States to have so many different viewpoints when you should be doing something uniformly.
When it comes to testing, the UK government has had difficulties with getting the testing up to where it needs to be, or certainly where it wants to be. I wonder whether you would characterise it as unacceptable for people who aren't symptomatic to try and get a test at this stage.
No, I don't think so. That's a good question. I'm glad you brought it up. That is a bone of contention now in the United States. And health officials like myself often, and I think that most of my colleagues agree with me, feel that testing people who are without symptoms is an important part of the public health endeavor and should be pursued. And the reason we know that now is that about 40 to 45% of all the infections are without symptoms. And in the United States, and I don't think it's any different in the UK, in the United States, about 50% of all the transmissions come from an asymptomatic person who then infects another person. So if you ignore asymptomatic infection, you're ignoring a very important part of the problem.
The health secretary here, Matt Hancock, has used that word, unacceptable, for people to go and get tests if they don't qualify for them by displaying some of the symptoms. I wonder if you see that as attempting to blame people or to try and stop those very important cases from getting a test.
Well, that's complicated because I think the point that your authorities are trying to say is something that we've even said in the United States, and that is not everybody who wants a test should get a test, but everybody who needs a test should get a test. I agree with that. However, if you want to do surveillance and you want to do the kind of tracking when you're dealing with a situation in which many asymptomatic people are spreading infection, that is a good reason to test people who are asymptomatic. That's different from somebody waking up one morning and say, hey, I think I'd like to get tested, and go and get tested for really no reason. There's a big difference between that and doing surveillance to determine how many asymptomatic carriers you have.
You've talked before about how over your career you've had sleepless nights worrying that the perfect storm of a respiratory virus that had a relatively high percentage morbidity chance would start to circulate around the population, and we are here now. This is the nightmare. I wonder, when thinking about the specifics of coronavirus and COVID-19, what it is about our response now that still keeps you up at night.
Well, the thing that bothers me the most is the fact that just what we were talking about a moment ago is that we have so much asymptomatic infection that we don't have a good handle on in this country and in the world. I'm sure there's no difference between what we're doing here and what you're doing in the UK, that the bottom line of all of this is going to be a safe and effective vaccine. Public health measures are extremely important, but if you want to get back to some degree of normality where we can get economies back in place, the situation in the United States, I'm sure, is similar for the UK. It's had a devastating economic impact. I mean, the unemployment is at records that it's never been in my lifetime. So we really need to do something about that, and I think a vaccine is going to get us there.
You talked earlier about the science changing and evolving, and that is, it's easier perhaps for science to move with the evidence rather more than politicians who might be viewed as U-turning, and it might be politically difficult to do those things. I just wonder, in all of this, as we approach it with a degree of humility, whether you think that you've made mistakes or errors or miscalculations during any of this.
You know, I don't think I would classify them as errors and mistakes. I would characterize them as making decisions and recommendations based on the data at the time. And when the data changed and you look back, you realize that that was not the right decision.
Can you think of a specific?
It was the right decision at the Well, I think the issue about masks, that's the first thing. I mean, we had a situation where we were very concerned that the public, by wearing and buying up the masks, there would not be enough masks for the healthcare providers who were putting themselves at risk every day to take care of individuals. So we played down the issue of using masks by the general public. Now, that's absolutely a must, that we're recommending universal using of masks. So when people look at that, they say, wait a minute, why did you change your mind? Did you not know what you were talking about? And the circumstances changed because two things happened. One, all of a sudden, industry provided with more masks than we ever could need. And number two, it became clear that people without symptoms were transmitting the virus. So therefore, everybody should be wearing a mask, not just people who felt that they were infected or not, because many people didn't know they were infected.
I wonder what the president made of that change in advice.
Well, we had a difficulty in the United States because the president, up until recently, has not really been wearing a mask, and even now he doesn't wear a mask.
Did he reject that when you changed that tack based on the evidence that came in? You said, "Look, Mr. President, this is now what we're recommending." Did he throw the paper up in the air? Did he clasp his hands to his face? What did he do?
No, I mean, it wasn't anything as dramatic as that, because he had not been wearing a mask anyway. So when we said we're going to start wearing a mask, obviously we know from history, from the news, that he was reluctant to assimilate that into his behavior. Right now, it's much, much better in the United States. There's much, much more mask wearing.
You've been asked this a million times, but and you're very diplomatic in your responses to it. I'm going to ask only to see if I can try and pierce through the diplomatic shield that you put up to these questions. But I wonder how you would characterize your relationship with the president.
It's complicated. I mean, when we're one-on-one, it is. When we're one-on-one in the Oval Office, we have a good, warm relationship. Mm-hmm. But yet, when I say things that I feel are the truth and the honest things that tend to sometimes conflict with what he says, he pushes back and he gets critical of me.
So it's complicated. It's complicated because he doesn't follow your scientific guidance or pushes back against it. That's what's complicating it.
Yeah, sometimes he does. I mean, to give him credit, he does sometimes do that. But there are times when he would say something or advocate for something that I would be against. And then that would be somewhat of a public conflict. But as a relationship, a personal relationship, it is a good relationship.
He's called you alarmist. I wonder whether you trust him.
Yeah, I do. I mean, he calls me alarmist, and I hit back and say I'm a realist. So,
is he a good leader for this moment, though? I mean, it's all right that leaders question advice that they're getting, whoever they're getting it from. But some of the questioning of the advice has led to the president turn to people like your good self and some of your scientific colleagues and talk about whether they can look at injecting bleach into people's organs.
Well, the one thing that I have learned, as you probably know, because I can see that you've done your homework, is that I have served 6 presidents since Ronald Reagan. And the reason why I'm still here serving presidents is that I sometimes do not answer questions that are definitely going to get you into trouble.
Well, I completely understand that, Dr. Fauci. I do understand that. But I wonder whether ultimately you feel that your first loyalty is to the people rather than to who the president may be.
Oh, that I have no trouble saying. I'm a servant of the people of the United States of America. It doesn't matter who the president is. My loyalty as a scientist is to the truth and the scientific evidence. And I will always speak the truth based on scientific evidence.
And you would call out a president who wasn't speaking the truth?
I have done that. I mean, I wouldn't be rude and try and insult anyone, but I would speak what I felt was the true scientific evidence and data, and I've done that. And just look at the track record.
And so therefore, has Donald Trump just finally has the president misled or lied to the public about the rumors about coronavirus?
No, we're not going to go there. There have been differences of opinion, but I'm not going to be saying what you'd like me to say.
Dr. Anthony Fauci. I didn't want him to say anything he didn't want to say. His were his own words. Still serving his 6th president of the United States. Dr. Anthony Fauci speaking to me exclusively here on Swarbrick on Sunday. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching to the programme this morning and this afternoon. Don't forget to join Nick Ferrari at breakfast tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. for Call Kia, where the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, will be taking your calls. 9 a.m, Nick Ferrari at breakfast. I'm back Monday night at 10 p.m. If you missed anything, the Global Player is there for you to download and to listen again. Coming up at 4, it's Ian Payne, right now on LBC. Imagine there was.
Thank you, Tom. Coming up, British perfume brand Jo Malone reshot a video made by their first global